the deepest vaults, beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there are archives the public will never see, not collections of scandal or conspiracy, but something older, something that made medieval popes commission silver doors and forbidden chapels. The Church has always known how to fight demons, with prayer, with exorcism, with faith. But werewolves were different. They were men who chose transformation, clergy who broke bread by day and hunted by moonlight. The devil corrupts the soul, the wolf corrupts the body, and worse, it suggests that salvation itself might wear teeth. Some heresies, the Vatican simply buried alive. Some manuscripts are not meant to be read by daylight, and certain texts require prayers we no longer remember. My name is Elena Torini, and I've served as an archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives for 16 years. Most people imagine our work as mysterious, but the truth is far more mundane. Hours of careful cataloging, environmental monitoring, and preservation work. We're custodians, not mystics. We handle everything from papal correspondence to medieval manuscripts with the same procedural reverence. Each document has its classification, its storage requirements, its access protocols. In September of 2023, I was assigned to catalog a collection of 14th century bestiaries that had been transferred from a monastery in Abruzzo. The monastery was being decommissioned and its library absorbed into our holdings. Standard procedure. I'd done similar work dozens of times. The manuscripts arrived in climate-controlled cases, each with preliminary documentation from the monastery's librarian. Most were familiar texts, copies of Physiologus, herbal compendiums, marginalia-filled psalters. I worked through them methodically, updating our digital records, checking their physical condition, assigning them shelf codes in the restricted collection. The Lupine Codex was the last manuscript in the shipment. It had no preliminary documentation, just a copper key taped to the case and a note in careful script, catalogued under seal. Bishop's authorization required for access. The case itself was unusual, older than the others, made of wood rather than modern archival materials. Inside, wrapped in linen that smelled faintly of myrrh, was a bound manuscript, perhaps 30 centimeters tall. The binding was leather, though unlike any I'd encountered. It had a strange texture, almost like suede, and when I first touched it, I noticed the warmth, not room temperature, but body temperature, as if someone had just been holding it. I made a note in my log: binding material, unidentified, requires conservation assessment. The manuscript was written in medieval Latin, the script neat and confident. The title page read Codex Lupinus de Natura et Sacramento Transformationis, the Lupin Codex on the nature and sacrament of transformation. I'd catalogued hundreds of bestiaries, texts describing real and mythical animals, their properties and spiritual meanings, but I'd never seen one describe transformation as a sacrament. I began my work, as I always did. Careful examination, photography, transcription of the opening pages. The text was structured like a liturgical manual, with numbered sections and marginal annotations. But instead of describing the Mass or confession, it detailed the process of becoming something else, of shedding human form through what it called the Lupine Sacrament. The language was precise, almost clinical. It described preparation rituals, fasting, prayer, the consumption of specific herbs. It referenced moon phases and saint days, and it treated the transformation not as demonic possession or curse, but as a holy mystery. a way of taking on the nature of the beast to better understand God's creation. I worked until 6 that evening, when the archives closed. I wrapped the codex carefully, returned it to its case, and locked it in the climate-controlled vault as protocol required. That night, I woke at 3:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I've developed the habit of checking my phone when I wake unexpectedly, an occupational hazard of working with centuries-old documents and worrying about environmental alarms. I was sitting upright in bed, breathing hard, though I couldn't remember dreaming. My hands were clenched. When I opened them, there was dried blood under my fingernails. I went to the bathroom and scrubbed them clean, telling myself I must have scratched myself in my sleep. Perhaps an allergic reaction to something in the archives, the dust of old manuscripts, the chemicals we used for preservation. I made a note to check the manuscript's condition for mold. The next day, I continued transcribing the codex. The middle sections described the transformation itself in language that felt too intimate, too experiential, to be merely academic. The author, who never identified themselves, wrote about the sensation of bone and muscle reshaping, about the expansion of consciousness to include senses humans don't possess, about seeing in darkness and understanding the language of scent. The lupine form is not abandonment of the human, one passage read, but its perfection. We are made in God's image, but the wolf is made in God's truth. To take this sacrament is to know the world as the saints knew it, without the veil of civilization, without the lies of language. The manuscript was illustrated, not extensively, but with small marginal drawings rendered in brown ink. Wolves in various poses, sitting, running, howling, and human figures in intermediate forms, not monstrous, but somehow reverent, as if the transformation were prayer made visible. I photographed everything, standard procedure. But when I reviewed the images that evening, some of the marginal illustrations looked different than I remembered. Small changes, the angle of a wolf's head, the position of a transformed figure's hands. I told myself it was the lighting, the angle of the camera. That night, I woke again at 3:17, same time, exact to the minute. And again, there was blood under my fingernails. More this time, enough that it had stained my sheets. I called in sick the next day. I needed to see a doctor. Clearly, something was wrong. Perhaps a sleepwalking disorder, triggered by stress. But when I examined my hands in daylight, there were no scratches on my body, no source for the blood, just the residue beneath my nails, as if I'd been digging in something. I should have stopped working on the codex then. Should have requested reassignment, claimed an allergy or sensitivity. But archivists are trained to complete their catalogs, and I had only a few sections left to document. I returned to the archives on the 4th day. The codex was exactly where I'd left it, still wrapped in its linen, still warm to the touch. I unwrapped it carefully and opened to the section I'd been working on. The text had changed, not dramatically, but phrases I transcribed 2 days ago now read differently. A word altered here, a line rewritten there. I checked my photographs, my transcription notes. The photographs showed the text as I'd originally transcribed it, but the manuscript itself had different words. I felt my hands begin to shake. Manuscripts don't change. Ink doesn't rewrite itself after 6 centuries. But I was holding the proof that this one had. The new text was more direct, more insistent. It addressed the reader, addressed me, in second person. You have touched the binding, it read. You have breathed the scent of the preserved oils. You have read the words of transformation. The sacrament begins not with acceptance, but with contact. I should have closed the manuscript, should have sealed it immediately, and reported it to my supervisor, but I kept reading. The text described stages, 3 nights of waking, 3 accumulations of blood, 3 opportunities to resist. After the 3rd night, it said, the reader would no longer be simply reading about the sacrament. They would be participating in it. The lupine form is patient, the text continued. It does not force. It invites. Each night you wake, you are closer to acceptance. Each time you find the blood, you are marking yourself for transformation. By the full moon, the sacrament will be complete. I checked the calendar on my phone with hands that had gone cold. Full moon was in 3 days. That afternoon, I went to Father Domenico, the priest who oversaw the archive's spiritual protocols. He was an old man, nearly 80, who'd spent his entire career among the Vatican's restricted collections. I told him about the codex, about the changing text, about waking at 3:17 with blood under my nails. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The Lupine Codex, he said finally. I thought it had been destroyed in the 1800s. You know about it. There are certain manuscripts we are instructed to refuse, he said. Texts that are not merely heretical, but participatory. The Codex was created by a Franciscan monk who believed lycanthropy was not a curse, but a spiritual gift. He infected 12 others before the Church intervened. Infected. The manuscript itself is the vector, Father Domenico said. The binding is made from the skin of those who underwent the transformation. The ink contains their blood. To read it is to invite their condition into yourself. The text changes because it responds to the reader. It knows what will convince you. I felt something cold settle in my chest. What do I do? The sacrament requires acceptance, he said. As long as you refuse, it cannot complete, but you must not touch the manuscript again. And you must not read what you've already transcribed, but I had read it. I'd spent 3 days absorbing its language, its logic, its strange liturgical beauty. And that night, when I woke at 3:17, I understood that part of me didn't want to refuse. The blood under my nails was darker this time. And when I looked at my hands in the bathroom mirror, I saw that my fingernails had grown longer, not dramatically, but noticeably, and they'd grown pointed. I called Father Domenico. He came to my apartment at 4 a.m. and prayed over me in Latin, old prayers I didn't recognize, from rituals not practiced in centuries. He gave me a rosary that had been blessed by 3 popes, and told me to pray it continuously until the full moon had passed. The archives will be closed to you for 1 month, he said. The codex will be sealed again. If you survive the full moon without transforming, you may return. If I survived, I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, praying the rosary until the words lost meaning. I didn't sleep. I was afraid of what I might wake up. On the night of the full moon, Father Domenico sat with me, reading scripture aloud, while I gripped the rosary hard enough to leave marks on my palms. At 3:17, I felt something shift inside me. Not a physical sensation, but a spiritual one. As if something that had been invited into my soul was now being refused entry. I prayed harder, and Father Domenico's voice grew louder, and somewhere in the darkness I felt the presence of the codex, warm and patient, and waiting, but I did not transform. When dawn came, Father Domenico examined my hands. The pointed nails had receded. The blood was gone. Whatever the sacrament had required of me, I had not given it. I returned to the archives. A month later, the Lupine Codex was gone. Relocated, I was told, to a sealed collection beneath the Vatican that requires the authorization of the Holy See itself to access. My catalog entry was deleted from our system. Officially, the manuscript was never transferred from Abruzzo, but sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I still wake with the memory of words I'm no longer allowed to read, and I find myself wondering about the monk who created the Codex, about what he saw in the Lupine form that made him call it a sacrament, about the transformation he believed would bring him closer to God's truth. The archives have rules about which manuscripts can be read and which must remain sealed. I understand those rules differently now. Some texts are dangerous, not because of what they say, but because of what they make you want to become. And the most terrifying heresies are not the ones that deny faith, but the ones that offer a different kind of salvation. I still work with bestiaries, but I wear gloves now, even with manuscripts I've handled 100 times before. And I never work past sunset, because there are sacraments the Church recognizes, and sacraments it has buried, and some transformations, once invited, never entirely leave. Some duties are inherited without explanation, and we perform them because the alternative is never discussed. My name is Father Domenico Rast, and I've served at the Vatican's Secretariat of State for 9 years. My official role involves diplomatic correspondence with Eastern European parishes, translation work mostly, the kind of quiet administrative service that keeps the Church functioning across borders and languages. But every priest assigned to the Secretariat receives one additional duty, passed down from their predecessor on their first day. Mine came from Father Terranova, 3 weeks before his reassignment to Munich. Every January 2nd, he told me, standing in my new office with a copper key in his palm, you must go to the Cappella dei Lupi. Unlock it before dawn. Place raw meat on the altar. Lock it again before sunrise. Never arrive late. Never look through the door before unlocking it. Never speak of this to anyone outside the Secretariat. I was young then, fresh from seminary, and I asked the obvious question. Why? Father Terranova's expression was one I've learned to recognize in Vatican service, the look of someone who has asked the same question and received no answer worth repeating. Because it's been done this way since 1793, he said, and placed the key in my hand. The Cappella dei Lupi isn't listed in any Vatican directory. It's located in the oldest section of the Apostolic Palace, accessed through a service corridor behind the Sala Regia. You have to know which door to take, which stairwell descends instead of rises. The chapel itself is small, perhaps 4 meters square, with no windows and no ornamentation, except a simple stone altar. The walls are bare plaster, water-stained and cold. There are no pews, no stations of the cross, no indication of what the space was originally used for. The door is iron-banded oak, nearly 8 centimeters thick, with 3 separate locks. The copper key opens all 3 in sequence, left, right, center. The door opens inward, and the hinges make no sound. For my first 5 years, the ritual was exactly as Father Terranova described. I would wake at 4 in the morning, on January 2nd, purchase fresh beef from the all-night butcher near Campo dei Fiori, 2 kilograms, bone-in, wrapped in brown paper. I would enter the Vatican through the Santa Anna Gate, walk the empty corridors to the chapel, unlock the door, and place the meat on the altar. The entire process took perhaps 20 minutes. I would lock the door again, return home, and continue my day as if nothing unusual had occurred. I never questioned it. The Vatican has maintained stranger traditions for longer periods. There are prayers that must be said at specific times in specific rooms. There are documents that can only be read by candlelight. There are chambers that remain locked, except during papal transitions. The Church is ancient, and some of its rituals exist simply because discontinuing them seems more dangerous than maintaining them. But in January of 2023, I made a mistake. I set my alarm as always, but I'd been working late on correspondence from the Orthodox Patriarch, and I'd taken a sleeping pill. When I finally woke, it was 4:47. The sky outside my window was beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but close, too close. I dressed quickly and took a taxi to the butcher. He was just closing, and I had to plead with him to sell me the meat. By the time I reached the Vatican, it was 5:31. Dawn comes early in January, and I could see the first copper light touching the dome of St. Peter's. I ran through the corridors, the wrapped meat heavy in my hands, my breath loud in the pre-dawn silence. When I reached the passage to the Cappella dei Lupi, I was sweating despite the cold. The door was where it always was, iron-banded and ancient. But something was different. There were marks on the wood, deep parallel grooves, 4 of them, running vertically down the door surface. Fresh marks. I could see pale wood in the cuts, not yet darkened with age. They started about waist height and dragged downward, as if something had clawed at the door from the inside. I stood there, the meat growing cold in my hands, and remembered Father Terranova's rules. Never arrive late. Never look through the door before unlocking it. I'd already violated the first rule. The sky was brightening. I could hear early morning staff beginning to move through distant corridors. If I didn't complete the ritual now, I would fail entirely. I took out the copper key. My hands were shaking. The first lock turned with its usual smooth click. The second lock required more pressure. It always did, some misalignment in the mechanism. The third lock stuck. I had to jiggle the key, and in that moment of struggle, I heard something from inside the chapel. Not a voice, not footsteps. Something rhythmic and organic, like breathing, but too deep and too slow to be human. The third lock finally released. I pushed the door open. The chapel was dark, as it always was. The air that flowed out was cold and carried a smell I'd never noticed before. Not decay, but something animal and living. The kind of smell you encounter in barns or stables, the musk of warm bodies in confined spaces. I couldn't see the altar from the doorway. The chapel's interior was too dark, and I'd never brought a light that wasn't part of the ritual. I was supposed to walk in, place the meat on the altar, and leave. But the breathing sound continued, and I realized it was coming from the back wall, beyond where the altar stood. I took one step inside. The floor was gritty beneath my shoes, covered in something that felt like sand or salt. 2 steps. 3. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and I could just make out the shape of the altar ahead. There was something on it already. Not meat, not any kind of offering. A shape, dark and irregular, too large to be what I'd left in previous years. As I stared, the shape moved. Not dramatically, just a small shift, the way a sleeping animal adjusts its position. The breathing grew louder. I placed the wrapped meat on the floor in front of the altar, not daring to approach closer. Then I backed out of the chapel, moving slowly, trying not to run. When I reached the threshold, I heard a sound that I still hear in my quietest moments. A sliding, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across stone. And beneath it, a sound that might have been a whimper, or might have been a word in a language I didn't know. I pulled the door shut and locked all 3 locks with trembling hands. The copper key was hot, as if I'd been holding it near a flame. I didn't go home. I went directly to my office and sat at my desk until normal working hours began. Then I searched the Secretariat's archives for any reference to the Cappella Dei Lupi, any explanation for the ritual I'd been performing. I found nothing. No chapel by that name in any directory. No January 2nd observance in any liturgical calendar. The corridor where the chapel stood wasn't even marked on official floor plans. It simply appeared as blank space between other rooms. But I did find something else. A personnel record from 1793. Father Angelo Grimaldi, formerly assigned to the Secretariat, transferred without explanation to a monastery in Calabria. His departure date was January 3rd. The record was marked with a red stamp I'd never seen before. Continuity maintained. Continuity maintained. That afternoon, I received a visitor. Cardinal Teresi, whom I'd never met, appeared at my office door. He was elderly, perhaps 80, with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to navigate Vatican politics across decades. "Father Rast," he said, "I understand this morning's duty was complicated." I didn't ask how he knew. In the Vatican, information moves through channels we're not meant to see. "The marks on the door," I began, "will be attended to." He sat down across from my desk. "You arrived late." "Yes, but you completed the duty." I placed the meat inside. He nodded slowly. "That's sufficient. The ritual will continue as before. Next January 2nd, you'll arrive on time. Cardinal, what is the chapel for?" "What am I feeding?" Cardinal Teresi was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Some questions have been asked before. None have been answered in ways that brought comfort. What you need to know is this. The ritual is older than either of us. It has never been interrupted since 1793. The meat is always consumed. The door is always locked, and the scratches you saw this morning, they've appeared before. Always when someone arrives late, always from the inside. But nothing can be locked inside if we're the ones with the key." Father Rast. His voice was gentle but absolute. "The Cappella Dei Lupi contains something that must be fed. Whether it was put there or found there, I don't know. Whether it lives or waits, I cannot say. What I know is that for 230 years, someone has performed this duty without fail, and the door has remained closed. Your predecessor understood this. His predecessor understood this. Now you understand it too." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Set 2 alarms next year," he said. "And if you ever arrive to find the door already open, do not enter. Lock it from the outside and call this number immediately." He placed a card on my desk with a phone number, but no name. That was last year. I've had 11 months to think about what I saw in the darkness beyond the altar, what I heard breathing in that cold space, what made those scratches dragging downward on a door that was definitely locked. I've set 3 alarms for this coming January 2nd. I've already purchased the meat. I will arrive early well before dawn, and I will complete the ritual exactly as prescribed, because some duties are inherited without explanation. And we perform them because the alternative, the moment when the door stands open and nothing requires feeding anymore, is too terrible to consider. The Cappella Dei Lupi remains locked. The copper key remains in my possession, and somewhere in the Vatican's oldest corridors, in a chapel that doesn't officially exist, something waits for January 2nd, something that leaves scratch marks from the inside. Something that has been fed for 231 years and must be fed for as long as the door can hold. There are routes we patrol and routes we are told to forget exist. My name is Matteo Voss, and I've worked Vatican security for 7 years. Not the ceremonial guards tourists photograph, but the night staff who monitor the restricted sectors, the archives beneath the archives, the sealed corridors that don't appear on any official map, the spaces between holy ground where the church keeps what it cannot explain and will not destroy. They hired me in 2017, after a background check that took 4 months and interviews with people who never gave their names. The pay was exceptional. The work was simple. Walk designated routes, check sealed doors, report anomalies. Most nights passed without incident. You learned quickly which rules were administrative formality and which rules were written in the kind of language that made your supervisor's face go carefully blank when you asked why. The rule about Corridor 7C was the latter kind. It was included in our protocol binder under lunar restrictions, printed on cream-colored paper with a red border. The kind of page that indicated ancient standing orders, ones that predated modern security systems and surveillance cameras. The language was specific. Corridor 7C, sub-basement level, East Wing Foundation, no patrol activity between moonrise and moonset. No exceptions. No clarification. Provided. I asked about it once, during my 2nd week. My supervisor, Domenico, was a 30-year veteran who'd worked every shift and sector the Vatican had. He looked at the protocol page, then at me. "You follow that one, exactly as written," he said. "You see the moon in the sky. You stay out of 7C. You don't question it. You don't test it. Some rules exist because men wiser than us learned the hard way." I followed it exactly as written. For 7 years, I avoided Corridor 7C during lunar hours without ever understanding why, until my partner broke the rule. His name was Luca Andretti. He'd been with Vatican security for 3 years, assigned to night shift rotation 6 months ago. He was younger than me, maybe 28. With the restless energy of someone who found routine suffocating. We worked well together. He handled the tedium better when he could talk, and I didn't mind the conversation. But Luca had a problem with unexplained rules. He needed reasons, logic. He'd spent his first months questioning every protocol, demanding justification for procedures that had existed since before we were born. Most of the time, it was harmless, just philosophical debate during long walks through empty corridors. But some rules aren't philosophical. It was October of 2024. The lunar calendar had been posted in our ready room for weeks. Full moon on the 15th, moonrise at 6:43, moonset at 7:21 the following morning. Standard procedure. Avoid 7C for those 13 hours. We had plenty of other routes to cover. Luca had been fixating on it for days. 13 hours, he kept saying. 1 corridor. What could possibly require that level of restriction? Structural damage. Archived materials. Why not just seal it permanently? Because they haven't, I told him. And that should tell you something. We started our shift at 10 that evening. I could feel it immediately. The quality of the air was different during full moons. Heavier somehow, like the weight of attention from something vast and patient. The Vatican's oldest foundations seemed to settle differently, stones creaking in patterns that felt almost rhythmic. We covered our routes systematically. North Wing archives, apostolic vault checks, the sealed chambers in the East Foundation, everything normal, everything logged. At 1:30, we stopped in the ready room for coffee. That's when Luca said it. I'm going to walk 7C. No. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. You're not. Matteo, it's a corridor, stone and air. There's no rational reason. There doesn't need to be a rational reason. The rule exists. That's enough. But I could see it in his eyes. The decision was already made. He'd been building to this for weeks, maybe months. The need to prove something, to himself, to the protocols, to whatever authority wrote rules without explanation. I'll be quick, he said. 15 minutes, just there and back. You won't even need to log it. I should have stopped him. Should have called Domenico, or physically blocked the access door, or invoked some regulation that would have made it impossible. But there's a paralysis that comes with watching someone choose their own breaking point. You recognize it too late, and by then the moment has passed. Luca took one of the handheld radios and a flashlight. The access door to 7C was in the East Wing Foundation, behind a maintenance panel that required a copper key. He unlocked it at 1:47. I know because I checked my watch, thinking I'd time his absence, document the violation, maybe convince him it was nothing, so he'd let it go. The door closed behind him, with a sound like a held breath released. I waited in the corridor outside. The stone walls around me were 16th century construction, built over 4th century foundations, layers of holy ground stacked like geological strata. Somewhere above, the basilica held its vigil. Down here, the air was cool and still. 5 minutes passed. 10. My radio stayed silent. At 15 minutes, I approached the access door. Put my hand on it. The metal was warm. Not hot, but body temperature, as if something living pressed against the other side. Luca, I called softly. No response. 20 minutes. I radioed Domenico. Told him what happened, expecting fury or panic. Instead, his voice went very quiet. Stay where you are, he said. Don't open that door. I'm sending a team. He's my partner, Matteo. The way he said my name carried 30 years of knowledge I didn't possess. Stay where you are. The team arrived 30 minutes later. 4 men I'd never seen before, wearing plain black suits with small silver crosses on their lapels. They didn't speak to me. One of them produced a different copper key, older than mine, the metal dark with age, and unlocked the access door. They went in with flashlights and returned 8 minutes later with Luca between them. He was walking on all fours, not crawling, not injured or disoriented, walking with the fluid coordination of something that had always moved that way. His spine curved differently, his weight distributed across his palms and the balls of his feet. His head was lowered, but his eyes, I caught them in the flashlight beam, were alert and aware. They took him past me, without explanation. He didn't make a sound. Just that steady, four-limbed gait, like something wearing Luca's shape, but remembering an older form. Domenico arrived. As they disappeared around the corner, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger, but something closer to resigned sadness. "Go home," he said. "Take tomorrow off. We'll handle the reports." What happened to him? He walked a forbidden route during lunar hours. That's what happened. Domenico locked the access door, pocketed the copper key. Some corridors remember things. Matteo, old shapes, old ways of being. During certain hours when the moon pulls at blood and water, those memories get stronger. We keep people out because the corridor doesn't just remember, it teaches. I went home, tried to sleep. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke to my phone, a text from an unknown number, an attached document, Luca's incident report, filed at 2:43. The report was in Latin. Perfect ecclesiastical Latin, the formal language of Vatican documents. Every detail logged with meticulous precision. The route, the timing, the sensation he described as remembering a shape my bones had forgotten. Luca had barely passed high school Italian. He'd never studied Latin, couldn't have written this, even with a translation dictionary. But something in Corridor 7C had taught him, had reminded him of something older than language, older than the upright human form, something that moved on four legs beneath the moon and wrote its nature in words Luca had never learned, but somehow now knew. I returned to work 3 days later. Luca was gone, transferred, they said, to a facility in northern Italy. Recuperation and assessment. They didn't say what they were assessing. Domenico pulled me aside my first night back. "You follow the lunar protocols," he said. Not a question. A statement of witnessed truth. I do, exactly as written. When the moon rises, I stay out of Corridor 7C. I don't question it. I don't test it, but sometimes, during full moons, I wake at 3:17 and check my phone, and sometimes there are messages, incident reports in Latin, filed from an unknown location, describing routes walked on four legs through corridors that remember older shapes. The last report arrived 2 weeks ago. The language was still perfect, still Latin, but the handwriting had changed, less controlled, more angular, as if written by fingers that were learning to hold a pen differently. There are routes we patrol, and routes we are told to forget exist, and in the foundations beneath the Vatican, in corridors built over ancient ground, there are lessons written in moonlight and stone, lessons about the shapes we wore before we stood upright. Lessons the Church cannot explain and will not destroy. Lessons that some men learn the hard way and carry in their bones forever after. Some confessionals are never meant to be opened again, and some priests should never be remembered by name. My name is Hannah Kloss, and I've spent 17 years restoring ecclesiastical woodwork throughout Europe. Choir stalls, altarpieces, communion rails, the hidden carpentry that holds the church's oldest spaces together. I work with my hands, with oil and beeswax, and patience, bringing warmth back to wood that's been cold for centuries. It's honest work, quiet work, and it's brought me into churches most tourists will never see. In September of 2023, I received a commission from the Vatican's Office for the Preservation of Sacred Architecture. They needed someone for a project in the Basilica di Santa Maria in Trastevere, specifically a confessional in the northern transept that hadn't been used since the 1950s. The piece dated to the 1200s, constructed from walnut and oak, with considerable smoke damage and wood deterioration. Standard restoration, cleaning, structural assessment, treatment for woodworm and dry rot. I met Monsignor Belletti on a Monday morning. He was perhaps 70, with a thin, careful movements of someone who'd spent a lifetime handling fragile things. He led me through the basilica's main floor to a side chapel I'd somehow missed on previous visits, a narrow space dedicated to St. Jerome, lit by a single window of old glass that turned the morning light amber. The confessional stood against the eastern wall, dark and somehow dense, as though it occupied more space than its dimensions suggested. The wood was nearly black with age and candle smoke, the carved panels barely visible beneath centuries of grime. It was sealed in 1954, Monsignor Belletti said. A structural concern, we were told, but the basilica's archives indicate it should be preserved, so the office has authorized its restoration. He handed me a single copper key. You'll work during morning hours only. The chapel is closed to visitors, but we ask that you secure the confessional each evening before you leave. I began that afternoon with documentation, photographs, measurements, wood samples for analysis. The confessional was built in the traditional style, 2 small chambers separated by a screen partition, with a central compartment for the priest. The penitent's side still had a kneeler, worn smooth by centuries of use. The priest's chamber was just large enough for a small bench and a crucifix mounted on the back wall. The wood was in worse condition than I'd expected. Not just smoke damage, the interior surfaces were pitted and scarred as though something had worried at them repeatedly. Deep gouges ran along the armrest on the penitent's side. The screening between chambers was brass mesh, green with verdigris but intact. I started with the exterior, using gentle solvents to remove the accumulated grime. Beneath the darkness, the walnut was still sound, though deeply stained. The carved panels depicted scenes from the Gospels: the prodigal son, the woman at the well, the good shepherd. Standard iconography for a confessional, imagery of forgiveness and return. By the 3rd day, I'd cleaned enough of the exterior to begin interior restoration. I opened the penitent's door. It resisted, the hinges seized with age and disuse, and shone my work light inside. That's when I found the first tooth. It was embedded in the wooden armrest, driven in at an angle, the root exposed where the surrounding wood had rotted away. Human by the size of it, an incisor yellowed with age. I photographed it before attempting removal, but it was wedged so deeply that I had to use a dental pick to work it free. I set it aside and continued my inspection. Within an hour, I'd found 6 more teeth, all pressed into the wood, all at different angles, as though they'd been bitten into the surface. 2 molars, 3 more incisors, 1 canine. Human dentition, adult, from what I could determine. But then I found others, smaller teeth, needle-sharp, arranged in rows. Not human, not anything I recognized. By day's end, I'd extracted 23 teeth from the penitent's chamber alone. I arranged them on a cloth, photographed them, and locked them in my equipment case before calling Monsignor Belletti. He arrived within the hour, studied my photographs without speaking, then examined the confessional himself. His fingers traced the holes where the teeth had been embedded, moving with the careful precision of reading Braille. "Continue your work," he said finally. "Document everything you find. I'll need to consult the basilica's archives. Monsignor, some of these teeth aren't human. Document everything," he repeated. "The office will want complete records." That night, I researched dental morphology, trying to identify the inhuman specimens. The small needle-like teeth suggested something carnivorous, a fox, perhaps, or a large cat, but the arrangement was wrong. The root structure too complex, and there were too many of them, pressed into the wood as though something had bitten the confessional repeatedly, leaving its teeth behind like offerings. I returned the next morning to find Monsignor Belletti waiting in the chapel. He held a leather folio, very old, marked with a red wax seal I didn't recognize. The archives contained confession logs from 1347 to 1436, he said, a period when this confessional was in regular use. The records are incomplete, but what remains is unusual. He opened the folio carefully. 47 penitents during that period reported the same experience during confession. They described feeling compelled to bite the wood, the armrest, the screening, the wall itself. Several report biting until their teeth broke, until they tasted blood. He turned the pages, his finger following faded ink. Each confession was heard by the same priest, Father Luca Toretti. His name appears in the logs across all 90 years. That's not possible. No, Monsignor Belletti agreed. It is not. He handed me the folio. The entries were in medieval Latin, written in different hands, the penitent's own confessions, transcribed by scribes, but each was signed by the same witness, Father Toretti, in a handwriting that never changed across 9 decades. There's more, the Monsignor said quietly. In 1437, the confessional was sealed by order of Pope Eugene IV. It was reopened in 1612, used briefly, then sealed again. Opened in 1798. Sealed in 1821. Each time, there are reports of complications. What kind of complications? He closed the folio. Penitents who entered, but could not recall their confessions afterward. Priests who refused to hear confessions there again. And in 1954, a young priest named Father Domenico entered the confessional's priest chamber to examine the crucifix. He emerged 3 hours later. The witnesses insist he was inside for no more than 10 minutes. Monsignor Belletti's voice was very quiet now. He would not speak of what occurred. He was transferred to a monastery in Switzerland, where he remains under contemplative silence. I spent that day working in the priest's chamber, and that's where I found the rest of the teeth. Hundreds of them, embedded in every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the bench, even the crucifix itself. They formed patterns I couldn't understand, arrangements that suggested language or mathematics or something else entirely. Human teeth and animal teeth, and teeth I couldn't identify, driven into the wood with such force that some had shattered on impact. The confession screen between chambers was the worst. Both sides were studded with teeth, pressed through the brass mesh from opposite directions, as though priest and penitent had both been compelled to bite, to break themselves against the barrier between them. I photographed everything. I measured the patterns. I tried to find some logic, some explanation, but there was only the evidence. Teeth embedded in sacred wood, confession logs spanning impossible years, and the name Luca Toretti written in unchanging script across 9 decades. At 5 in the evening, as the amber light through the window began to fail, I heard it, a whisper from inside the confessional, Latin words, soft and patient, coming from the priest's chamber where no one sat. The rhythm of the confessional rite, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," but backwards, inverted, the absolution spoken before the confession, the penance before the sin. I backed away slowly. The whisper continued, never rising, never stopping, and through the brass screening, in the dying light, I saw movement in the priest's chamber, not a figure, exactly. More like the suggestion of attention, of patient waiting, of appetite held in check by ritual and wood and 9 centuries of containment. I left the chapel. I left my equipment. I walked through the basilica and into the Roman evening, and I did not look back. Monsignor Belletti called the next morning. My restoration work was complete, he said. The office had decided to seal the confessional permanently. I would be compensated in full for my contracted time. My documentation had been received and was now under archival protection. I was not to discuss the project or return to the basilica's northern transept. I agreed to everything. I signed the papers they sent, but I kept one thing, a photograph of the confession logs, particularly the signatures. Luca Toretti, written in the same hand from 1347 to 1436, the same hand that appeared again in 1612, in 1798, in 1954. The same hand that appeared in the Basilica's visitor log from 2023, 3 days before I began my work. A simple notation in the records book, Father L. Toretti, entered for private devotion, northern transept, 5:23 in the morning. Monsignor Belletti died 6 weeks after my work concluded. Natural causes, the announcement said. He was buried in the basilica's crypt, and at his funeral I noticed something I'd missed before. Several of the older priests kept their distance from the northern transept. Not obviously, just a subtle redirection of their path, a preference for other routes through the basilica. They knew. They'd always known. I don't restore confessionals anymore. I declined 3 commissions this year alone, all from churches with sealed chambers and incomplete histories. The work requires a faith I can no longer maintain. Faith that confession brings absolution, that the space between priest and penitent is sacred rather than hungry, that what waits in the oldest confessionals is divine patience rather than something else entirely. But sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake with the taste of wood in my mouth and the memory of that whisper in backwards Latin, and I think of Father Toretti, whose name appears across 5 centuries, whose confessional collected the teeth of those who knelt before him. I think of what might wait in the priest's chamber, patient and eternal, hearing confessions that are never absolved, granting penance that is never complete. The Vatican sealed the confessional with concrete and steel. They will not say why. They will not say what became of Father Toretti, or whether he was ever really a priest at all, or what function that confessional truly served. But I know what I found, embedded in that sacred wood. Evidence not of devotion, but of hunger, not of mercy, but of something that wears mercy's shape and speaks with mercy's voice and waits in the darkness between confession and absolution, collecting what it's some. Prohibitions in the church are not about protection, but containment. My name is Paolo Di Sante, and I have served as a junior archivist in the Vatican secret archives for 7 years. Not the apostolic archives that tourists hear about. Those are merely extensive. I work 3 levels below, in the sections that require written permission from the prefect and a signed acknowledgement that certain documents are to be read, but never discussed. We catalog materials that the Church has decided must exist in record, but not in common knowledge. It is quiet work, methodical. Most days I spend 8 hours translating inventory lists from Latin, cross-referencing acquisition dates, ensuring that sealed folios remain sealed and that red tab documents are handled only with gloves. I share an office with 2 other archivists, both older than me, both content to work in silence. We take our lunch in a small refectory that smells of espresso and old paper. We speak rarely, and never, about what we read. In October of 2023, I was assigned to digitize a collection of 16th century papal bulls that had been stored in climate-controlled cabinets since the 1950s. The work was tedious, but necessary. Photograph each document, verify the wax seals, update the catalog with any notations or marginalia that previous archivists might have missed. Most of the bulls dealt with administrative matters. Appointments of bishops, land grants, disputes over benefices. But on a Tuesday afternoon, I opened a leather portfolio marked with a small copper clasp and found a document that made me pause. It was dated 1563, issued under Pius IV. The Latin was formal, the calligraphy precise, but the content was strange. It declared that certain monsignors serving in the curia, 11 names were listed, were forbidden from sitting for portraits, from being sketched during public ceremonies, and that no likeness of them should be commissioned or displayed. The reasoning given was vague. For the preservation of sacred office and the protection of holy representation. I'd never encountered anything like it. The Church has always documented its hierarchy extensively. Portraits of cardinals and bishops line every corridor. To specifically forbid the creation of images seemed not just unusual but deliberately contrary to institutional practice. I noted it in my digitization log and continued working. But that evening, as I filed the day's photographs, I found myself returning to those 11 names. I recognized 3 of them. Monsignors who had served under multiple popes in the late 16th century, men whose careers I'd encountered in other documents, men who, despite holding significant positions, seemed to appear rarely in the historical record. The next morning, I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I accessed the portrait collection database. The Vatican maintains extensive records of its official portraits, paintings, sculptures, commemorative medals. Every cardinal, most bishops, many monsignors have been documented across the centuries. I searched for the 11 names from the papal bull. 7 had no portraits at all, no paintings, no drawings, no record of any visual representation. It was as if they'd been methodically erased from iconography. But 4 of them did have portraits, official paintings, commissioned during their service, currently housed in the Apostolic Palace. According to the database, they hung in a corridor near the Sala Regia, a section used primarily for administrative offices. I should have left it alone. The papal bull was clear, even if its reasoning was obscure. But I'm an archivist. We pursue documentation. We verify sources. On my lunch break that day, I walked to the Apostolic Palace. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, lined with portraits of minor clergy from the 16th and 17th centuries. I found the 4 paintings without difficulty. They were labeled with brass plaques bearing the names from the papal bull: Monsignor Bartolomeo Sacchi, Monsignor Giuliano della Rovere, Monsignor Cesare Borromeo, Monsignor Tommaso Perentucelli. They were formal portraits, typical of the period. Dark robes, solemn expressions, hands positioned in gestures of blessing or holding braveries. The frames were gilded and ornate, the gold leaf catching the dim overhead lighting. I stood before the first portrait, Sacchi, and studied it carefully. A thin face, narrow nose, dark eyes, painted with competent but not exceptional skill. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed the reflection. The gilded frame acted as a mirror. The gold surface, polished enough to throw back a distorted image of the portrait itself. And in that reflection, the face was different. Not dramatically, but the jaw was longer. The eyes set wider apart, and something about the angle of the mouth, it suggested a shape that didn't quite match the painted expression. I moved to the second portrait. Same effect. The reflection in the gilded frame showed a face that was almost but not quite the same as the painting. Delarover's painted face was round and gentle. His reflection was narrower, sharper. The third portrait, Borromeo, made my hands start to shake, because when I looked at the reflection in the frame's gold surface, the eyes caught the light wrong. They reflected a faint luminescence, like animal eyes in headlights, a quality that human eyes do not possess. I spent 40 minutes in that corridor, moving between the four portraits, studying them from different angles. The paintings themselves were normal, unremarkable, but their reflections, every one showed faces that deviated from the painted image in subtle but consistent ways. Longer jaws, eyes spaced too far apart. And that strange quality of light, as if something behind the eyes was refracting illumination differently than human tissue should. I returned to the archives and requested access to the prefect's office. I needed to report what I'd found, to ask whether this was known, whether there was protocol for this kind of anomaly. His assistant, a priest in his 60s, named Father Agnelli, met me at the door. The portraits near Sala Regia, I said. The four monsignors from the 1563 bull, their reflections don't match. Father Agnelli's expression didn't change, but something happened to his posture, a subtle stiffening, like a soldier coming to attention. You examined the frames, he said. Not a question. The gold surface reflects the paintings, but the faces are different. Come with me. He led me not to the prefect's office, but down a stairwell I'd never used, to a storage room 2 levels below my usual workspace. Inside were filing cabinets marked with red tabs, documents that required special clearance. Father Agnelli unlocked one cabinet and removed a folder. Inside were photographs, black and white, dated to the 1930s. They showed the same corridor I'd visited, the same 4 portraits, but in the photographs, the paintings looked different. The faces in the frames were the elongated ones, the wrong ones, the faces I'd seen only in reflection. And the reflections in the gilded frames showed the normal faces, the ones that now appeared in the paintings themselves. They were moved in 1937, Father Agnelli said quietly. Taken down, cleaned, restored. When they were rehung, the faces had changed, not the frames, the paintings. What was in the reflection became the image. What was painted became the reflection. I stared at the photographs. How is that possible? In 1563, Pius IV received a report from his master of ceremonies. 11 monsignors had been observed during night offices. Their shadows, when cast by candlelight, did not match their forms. Their reflections in polished silver showed faces that were not their own. He closed the folder. The bull was issued to prevent further documentation, to ensure that whatever had taken residence in those men would not be preserved in permanent record. But the portraits were painted anyway, by artists who didn't read Latin, who followed commissions without understanding why they'd been forbidden. He returned the folder to the cabinet. The paintings captured something, not the men themselves, but what wore them. And when you look at the reflections, When light bounces off gold instead of being absorbed by paint, you see what was underneath. I thought of those eyes, catching light the wrong way. Are they still here? The Monsignors. They were never here, Father Agnelli said. Not in the way you mean. The men whose names appear in the bull served their terms and died. Most have no graves. They were buried in unmarked sites, with night offices, under protocols that no longer exist in writing. He walked me back to the stairwell. At the door he paused. The portraits will be moved again soon, to a storage facility outside Rome. The corridor will be repainted, the brass plaques removed. He looked at me with the weariness of someone who has had this conversation before. You will not discuss what you've seen. You will not return to that corridor, and you will never, under any circumstances, photograph those frames. I agreed. I signed a document that evening, acknowledging my understanding of protocols regarding sensitive materials. But 3 nights later, I woke at 3:17 in the morning with the certainty that I was being watched, not by anything in my apartment, by something in the memory of those portraits, in the space between paint and reflection, between what appears and what is underneath. I don't work in the archives anymore. I requested a transfer to the Vatican museums, to public-facing collections where everything is documented and labeled and safe. Father Agnelli approved it without comment. Sometimes I pass the corridor near Sala Regia. The portraits are gone now. The walls repainted a neutral cream, but there are still brass plaques, still frames hanging in that narrow space. Different faces, different names. I never look at the reflections, because I understand now that some images are not meant to be preserved, that the Church's prohibition on photography, on permanent documentation, was not about vanity or superstition. It was about ensuring that certain faces, certain things that learned to wear faces, would not be fixed in time, would not be given the permanence of record. The 11 names in the papal bull are still in the archives. Their documents still exist, sealed and red-tabbed and filed in climate-controlled darkness. But there are no portraits, no photographs, no permanent record of what they looked like when light hit them from certain angles. And in the Vatican's oldest protocols, in procedures written in Latin and locked in cabinets that require 2 keys, there is still a rule about mirrors and gold leaf and candlelight in chambers where certain monsignors once prayed, a rule about what reflections can reveal when the surface is sacred and the light falls. Some maintenance tasks in the Vatican are not about cleanliness, but containment. My name is Irina Basarab, and I have worked as a night custodian in the Vatican archives for 17 years. I am Romanian by birth, Catholic by choice, and meticulous by necessity. The archives demand precision, temperature controls checked hourly, humidity levels recorded, dust removed from manuscripts that survived the fall of empires. Every action follows protocol. Every task has its reason, even if that reason is not explained. I work from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, alone except for the Swiss guard who checks my credentials at the entrance. The silence in the archives is profound, not peaceful, but watchful. 16 centuries of documentation rest in these climate-controlled chambers. Papal bulls and excommunication orders, trial records and confessions, letters describing miracles and heresies, all preserved in acid-free boxes and cataloged according to systems I will never fully understand. My duties are simple. I clean the public reading rooms, polish the brass fixtures, ensure the environmental systems function properly. And every Thursday night, I tend to the silver doors. There are 3 of them, in a corridor beneath the main archive floor. The passage requires a key. I keep on a copper chain around my neck, a key issued to me on my first night by Monsignor Brazzi, the archives director. He was an old man even then, with hands that trembled when he gave me my instructions. The silver doors must be polished every Thursday, without fail, he said. You will use only the cloth and solution provided. You will not attempt to open them. You will not ask what lies beyond them. This is not curiosity, Arena. This is duty. Do you understand? I understood that I needed the job, that the Vatican paid well, and asked few questions about my immigration status, that the work was solitary and suited me. Yes, Monsignor, I said. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. The silver is not decorative. Remember that. Every other door in the archives is fitted with brass or gold plate. Only these 3, spaced 10 meters apart in that lower corridor, are covered in silver. Tarnished silver that I polish each Thursday with a solution that smells of ammonia and something else, something almost medicinal. The doors have no handles, no visible locks, just smooth silver surfaces, marked with symbols I recognize as religious but cannot name. Crosses, certainly, but also older marks, symbols that might have predated the church itself. For 16 years, I maintained this routine without incident. Thursday nights, after completing my other duties, I would descend to the lower corridor and spend 2 hours polishing those doors until they gleamed. The work was meditative. The silver would warm under my cloth, and sometimes I imagined I could feel a vibration through the metal, rhythmic, almost like breathing. But the archives play tricks with sound, with perception. I learned not to trust such impressions. Then came Easter week of 2024. The Vatican fills with visitors during Holy Week, and the archives extend their hours to accommodate researchers. Monsignor Brazzi, now 93, and rarely leaving his office, requested that I adjust my schedule. Work Sunday through Wednesday, he said, and take Thursday through Saturday off. The silver doors could wait 1 week. 1 week would not matter. I should have questioned this, should have remembered his warning from 17 years ago, but I was tired, and the thought of 3 consecutive nights away from the archives felt like an unexpected grace. I returned on Sunday night, April the 14th. The Swiss guard, who checked my credentials, seemed nervous, though he said nothing. The environmental systems registered normal. The reading rooms were undisturbed. I completed my usual rounds, noting nothing unusual, and at 2 in the morning, I descended to the lower corridor with my polishing supplies. The smell reached me before I saw anything else. Organic and slightly sweet, like flowering plants, left too long in stagnant water. Wrong for this place, wrong for any archive. The silver doors had tarnished badly in my absence, black streaks spreading across their surfaces like burns. But it was the door frames that stopped me in the corridor, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. Hair was growing from the seams, not fine hair, but coarse strands the color of iron, emerging from the gaps between door and frame. They moved slightly in the still air, swaying with a motion that had no source. I stood perhaps 3 meters away, my hand gripping the copper key chain, trying to understand what I was seeing. The hair continued down the sides of the frames and pooled slightly on the floor. In some places, It had begun to mat together, forming patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost linguistic. I should have reported this immediately, should have contacted Monsignor Brazzi or the Swiss guard. Instead, I approached the first door with my polishing cloth, telling myself this was simply a maintenance issue. A failure of the environmental systems, allowing some organism to grow in the sealed spaces. The hair recoiled when I touched the silver, not dramatically, but I felt it withdraw, felt the strands pull back into the seams, like something flinching from heat. The door itself had grown warm, not hot, but body temperature warm. Alive warm. I began polishing with shaking hands. The tarnish came away in black streaks, and as the silver brightened, the hair retreated further. But I could hear something now, a sound from beyond the door. Not loud, not quite voices, more like breathing heard through a wall or the rustle of something shifting its weight. By the time I finished the first door, my cloth was stained black, and the hair had withdrawn completely into the seams. The door was cool again, the silver gleaming. But I could still hear that sound, fainter now, but present, waiting. The second door was worse. The hair had grown thicker here, forming a kind of fringe around the entire frame. When I began polishing, it did not withdraw cleanly. Strands clung to my cloth, and when I tried to pull them free, they were warm and slightly damp. The symbols on the door's surface seemed darker than I remembered, as though the tarnish had settled into their grooves permanently. The sound from beyond this door was different, more deliberate, almost rhythmic. I worked faster, scrubbing at the silver until my arms ached. The ammonia smell of the solution mixed with that sweet organic scent, and I had to stop twice to breathe, to tell myself I was simply cleaning doors, performing maintenance, following protocol. When I reached the third door, I found it partially obscured. The hair had grown so profusely that it formed a curtain across the lower half of the entrance, swaying gently as though moved by breath from the other side, and in the pattern of the strands, I could see shapes, almost faces, almost hands, suggestions of forms pressed against the door from within, trying to push through. I did not want to touch this door. Every instinct told me to leave, to seal the corridor, to never return. But Monsignor Brazzi's voice echoed in my memory. The silver is not decorative. I understood now. The polishing was not about appearance. It was about maintaining a barrier. The silver needed to be kept pure, kept active, to hold back whatever existed beyond those doors. And I had left it untended for 4 days. I started polishing at the top of the door, where the hair was thinnest. My cloth made the silver bright, and the hair withdrew from those sections. But at the bottom, where the growth was densest, I had to push through the curtain of strands. They clung to my hands, my arms, warm and somehow searching, and the sound from beyond the door became clear, whispering, in a language I did not know but somehow understood. Not words exactly, but meaning, impressions pushed directly into my thoughts. We have waited. The threshold grows thin. 1 more week. 1 more lapse. I polished until my hands bled, until the silver blazed in the corridor's dim light, and every strand of hair had retreated. The doors were clean again, contained again, but I could feel them watching me through the metal, aware of me. Aware that the barrier had weakened. When I returned to the main archive floor, I found Monsignor Brazzi waiting by the environmental controls. He looked ancient in the fluorescent light, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You polished them," he said. Not a question, Yes, Monsignor. He nodded slowly. I should not have asked you to miss the Thursday. It was my error. Age makes us forget the importance of consistency. He reached into his cassock and withdrew a small wooden box. From now on, if any circumstance prevents your Thursday maintenance, you will call this number immediately. He handed me a card with a phone number written in ink. No name, no explanation. What are they, Monsignor? The question escaped before I could stop it. What's behind those doors? He looked at me with something like pity. Doors exist to keep things separated, Irina. Some on this side, some on the other. The silver helps maintain that separation. That is all you need to know. But we both knew it was not all. We both knew that whatever existed beyond those doors was patient and purposeful. That it tested the barriers. That it had been waiting for a lapse, however brief. Will I continue the Thursday maintenance? I asked. Yes. Every Thursday. No exceptions. He turned to leave, then paused. And Irina, if you ever find the hair again, even after polishing, if it returns within the week, you will not touch the doors. You will call that number and evacuate the archive immediately. Do you understand? Yes, Monsignor. He left me standing in the reading room, surrounded by centuries of carefully preserved secrets, holding a phone number for a circumstance too terrible to name. That was 6 months ago. I have not missed a Thursday since. The silver doors remain clean and bright. The hair has not returned, and the sounds from beyond have quieted to barely perceptible whispers. But I know they are still there, still waiting, still testing the barriers that men much wiser than I decided must never fail. Every Thursday night, as I polish those doors, I wonder how many other custodians have performed this duty. How many, across the centuries, have kept the silver pure without understanding why. And I wonder what would happen if the Thursday maintenance stopped entirely, if the doors were left untended until the silver went completely black, until the hair grew thick enough to push them open. I do not dwell on these thoughts. They are not productive. My duty is simple. Maintain the barrier. Keep the silver pure. Never ask questions that have no good answers. Some maintenance tasks in the Vatican are not about cleanliness, but containment, and some doors are not meant to keep people out, but to keep other things in. We polish them weekly, not from tradition, but from necessity. The silver is not decorative. I understand that now, and I will never miss another Thursday. Some records in the secret archives are marked with a silver crescent, and we are instructed never to request them after sunset. My name is Father Lucas Brennan, and I have served as a junior archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives since 2022. It's quiet work, the kind that suits men like me, scholars who find God more readily in silence and old paper than in crowds or ceremony. I catalog, I preserve, I occasionally assist senior researchers with translation work. Most days, I'm alone among the stacks for hours, and that solitude feels sacred in a way I cannot adequately explain. The archives occupy 53 miles of shelving in a climate-controlled wing beneath the Vatican. We maintain strict protocols. White gloves, always. No bags or pens near the manuscripts. Every document signed out and returned within the same day. The oldest materials, anything predating 1400, require supervisor approval and are kept in the restricted collection, accessed through a separate entrance that requires 2 keys. I had been working on a routine project that spring, cataloging 15th century parish records from northern Italy, when I found the registry. It was misfiled, tucked between 2 volumes of baptismal records from Tuscany. The binding was plain leather, the pages vellum, the title written in careful Latin, Registrum Nominum Mutatorium, Decretum Apostolicum, the registry of changed names, by apostolic decree. I opened it carefully. The entries began in 1207 and continued through 1649. Each page listed a name, a date, and a papal seal notation. But what caught my attention immediately was the pattern in the surnames. Gregorius Wolf, changed to Gregorius Montagna by decree of Innocent III, Anno Domini 1207. Petrus Lupo, changed to Petrus Marinus by decree of Gregorian IX, Anno Domini 1229. Thomas Lowell, changed to Thomas Hastings by decree of Urban IV, Anno Domini 1264. Page after page, perhaps 200 entries total. Every original surname was canine: Wolf, Lupo, Lowell, Blade, Vilcus, German, Italian, English, Welsh, Lithuanian. All wolves, all changed by papal authority to something innocuous. Mountains, seas, common places. I should have logged it and moved on. Should have asked my supervisor about the proper cataloging procedure. But I was curious in the way archivists are cursed to be curious, and the registry wasn't marked with any special designation. No red stamp, no restricted notation. Just misfiled. That evening, before leaving, I made a list of 20 names from the registry. I wanted to research their lives, understand why the church had systematically changed their surnames. It seemed like the kind of historical puzzle that would make an interesting footnote in a journal article. I began my research the next morning with the Vatican's death records, which are extensive and well organized. Priests' deaths are always carefully documented: where they died, how, who administered last rites. The first name I searched was Gregorius Wolf, changed to Montaigne in 1207. I found his death record from 1234. Cause of death: Redus a diem sub luna, returned to God under the moon. I'd never seen that phrase used before. I searched the second name, Pietro Lupo, changed to Marinus, death record from 1251, same cause, Redus a diem sub luna. I checked all 20 names, every single one spanning 4.5 centuries, dying in different regions, different circumstances, listed the identical cause of death: returned to God under the moon. By noon, my hands were shaking slightly as I wrote. This couldn't be coincidence. This was protocol, a code phrase used across centuries for a specific type of death that the church needed documented but not explained. I found my supervisor, Father Dante, in his office reviewing acquisition requests. He was 63, Roman, and had worked in the archives for 30 years. If anyone would know about obscure ecclesiastical terminology, it would be him. Father Dante, have you ever encountered the phrase Redditus ad dam sub luna in death records? He looked up from his papers. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle stiffening, like a man hearing a name he'd hoped never to hear again. Where did you see that phrase? In death records. Multiple records, actually, from different centuries. Which records, specifically? His voice remained level, but his eyes had gone very focused. I told him about the registry, about the changed names, about the pattern I'd found. As I spoke, Father Dante's face grew carefully blank, the kind of blankness that is itself revealing, a deliberate erasure of reaction. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the registry." We returned to the stacks together. I led him to where I'd been working, to the shelf where I'd found the volume. It wasn't there. I checked the surrounding shelves, thinking perhaps I'd misremembered the location. Father Dante watched me search, saying nothing. After 10 minutes, I had to accept what was obvious. The registry was gone. "I had it yesterday," I said. "Right here." I didn't sign it out. I know I should have, but it seemed like a simple cataloging matter. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" Father Dante interrupted. "No, just you." He nodded slowly. "Father Lucas, I'm going to ask you to stop pursuing this research. Consider it a personal favor. Some historical questions are better left to senior archivists with appropriate clearance, but I never saw any restricted markings." Nevertheless, he placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. "Trust me in this. Please." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those names, the methodical pattern of them, 200 priests across 4 centuries, all with wolf surnames, all renamed by papal decree, all dying the same way. Under the moon, at 3:17 in the morning, I woke from dreams. I couldn't quite remember, my heart racing. I found myself thinking about the restricted collection, about the documents that required supervisor approval, about what other registries might exist that I'd never been told about. The next day, Father Dante was absent. His office was locked. I worked my usual shift, cataloging parish records, trying to focus, but in the afternoon, I noticed something. One of the senior archivists, Father Orsini, was watching me. Not obviously, but I'd catch him glancing my way, his expression evaluating. At the end of the day, as I was preparing to leave, Father Orsini approached me. "Father Brennan, you've been reassigned. Effective immediately, you'll be working in the Modern Documents section, 20th century materials only. Your access to medieval collections has been suspended pending review." "Review of what?" "Cataloging protocols. Father Dante noted some irregularities in your handling of sensitive materials." His tone was neutral, administrative. "It's routine, nothing to be concerned about." But it wasn't routine. I'd worked in the archives for 2 years without a single protocol violation, and the Modern Documents section was where they assigned archivists who couldn't be trusted with anything important. Recent papal correspondence, tourist-accessible materials, things that had already been digitized and studied to death. I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation. But something in Father Orsini's eyes stopped me, the same careful blankness I'd seen in Father Dante's face. This wasn't punishment. This was protection. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I returned to the archives after hours. I still had my access card, and no one had explicitly revoked my entry privileges. I told myself I just needed to understand, to find some rational explanation for what I'd discovered. The archives were dark, except for emergency lighting. My footsteps echoed in the vast spaces between the stacks. I made my way to the restricted collection entrance, knowing I couldn't get through the locked doors, but hoping perhaps I might find something, some clue in the catalog system. As I approached the entrance, I saw candlelight beneath the door, heard voices, low, rhythmic, Latin, but not any liturgy I recognized. I shouldn't have listened. I knew it even as I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the heavy wood. The words were a prayer, but also a binding. A plea for containment, and among the Latin phrases, I heard names, the wolf names from the registry, spoken with careful reverence and unmistakable fear. Then I heard something else, from deeper within the restricted collection, past where the voices were praying, a sound like breathing, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too resonant, and beneath it, barely audible, something that might have been scratching. The praying stopped abruptly. I heard footsteps approaching the door from inside. I ran, quickly and quietly as I could, back through the stacks and out of the archives. My hands were shaking as I swiped my access card. The door clicked open, and I stumbled out into the cool night air of the Vatican gardens. I didn't return to my apartment. That night, I walked the gardens until dawn, trying to understand what I'd heard, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood, that my imagination had filled in gaps with impossible things. When I reported for work the next morning, Father Orsini was waiting for me. "Father Brennan, there's been a change in your assignment. You're being transferred to our satellite archive in Milan, effective immediately. Your replacement has already been arranged, and accommodations in Milan are prepared." "I don't understand. It's a promotion, really. More responsibility, better access to Renaissance materials. You'll do important work there." But we both knew what it was. I was being removed. Sent away from whatever I'd stumbled onto, from questions I should never have asked. I've been in Milan for 7 months now. The work is fine. The archive respectable. I catalog Renaissance correspondence and merchant records. Nothing older than 1450. Nothing that requires special protocols or supervisor approval. Last month I received a letter from Father Dante. There was no return address, just a Vatican postmark. Inside was a single page, written in his careful hand. Some bloodlines carry old covenants, made before the Church, but honored by it. We do not break what was bound. We do not reveal what must remain hidden. Trust that there are protocols older than our understanding, and necessary beyond our judgment. Do good work in Milan, Father Brennan. Stay in the light of recent centuries. I keep the letter in my desk drawer. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I take it out and read it again, trying to find meaning in what it doesn't say. I don't know what happened to those 200 priests, why their wolf names required changing, or what it meant that they all returned to God under the moon. I don't know what breathes in the restricted collection, or why prayers of binding are still necessary after 8 centuries. But I know this. There is a registry marked with a silver crescent, and there is a reason we're instructed never to request it after sunset. Some truths are kept not because they're false, but because they're true in ways that faith alone cannot contain. I do good work in Milan. I stay in the light of recent centuries. And when the moon is full, I make sure I'm never alone after dark. Some manuscripts are not archived for preservation, but for containment. My name is Zara Malik, and I've worked in the Vatican's secret archives, now called the Apostolic Archives, though we still use the old name among ourselves, since 2019. I came to Rome with a doctorate in medieval paleography and a specialty in illuminated manuscripts. For 4 years, I cataloged and conserved some of the world's most sacred texts, working in temperature-controlled rooms where silence is both protocol and prayer. I thought I understood the nature of my work. I thought I knew what lived in the Vatican's deepest collections. Then, in October of 2023, Monsignor Catalano called me into his office. He was the archive's deputy prefect, a careful man who'd spent 30 years in the Vatican's labyrinthine documentation systems. He closed the door behind me, unusual, and placed a red folder on his desk. "We need a condition assessment," he said. "Codex Luporum. It's housed in Chamber 17. I'd never heard of Chamber 17, and I said so. 40 meters below the basilica, he explained. Accessible through the Borgia apartments, then down. The chamber was built in the 13th century for a specific purpose, to house a single manuscript that requires isolated storage. He slid the folder toward me. Inside was a single page of instructions, handwritten in Latin. I translated as I read. Enter alone. Do not read aloud. Complete the assessment between the hours of 2 and 4 in the afternoon only. Do not turn your back to the manuscript while in the chamber. Exit before the bells ring for vespers. Why these protocols? I asked. Monsignor Catalano looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Because they have kept the manuscript contained for 700 years. You'll understand when you see it. He gave me a copper key, heavy and old, its teeth worn smooth by centuries of use. Father Domenico will escort you down. He knows the way. Father Domenico met me the next afternoon in the Borgia apartments, the Renaissance chambers where Alexander VI once lived, now closed to tourists and used primarily for storage. He was perhaps 70, stooped and silent, carrying a single candle in a brass holder despite the electric lights along the walls. We walked through rooms I'd only seen in photographs, past faded frescoes, and locked doors marked with numbers I didn't recognize. At the back of a chapel dedicated to St. Catherine, Father Domenico opened a door I'd never noticed. It was painted to match the wall, nearly invisible, unless you knew where to look. Behind it, stone steps descended into darkness. We went down in silence, the candle flame steady despite our movement. The air grew colder with each level. I counted 3 landings, each with corridors branching in different directions, before Father Domenico stopped at a copper-plated door, marked with the Roman numeral 17. 2 hours, he said, handing me the candle. I'll wait at the top of the stairs. I unlocked the door with the key Monsignor Catalano had given me. It opened smoothly, well-maintained, despite its age. Inside, the chamber was perhaps 4 meters square, carved directly from the bedrock beneath the Vatican. The walls were bare stone. A single wooden reading table stood in the center, and on it, under glass, lay the manuscript. I set the candle on the table and looked at the codex through the protective case. It was a bestiary, a medieval encyclopedia of animals, both real and mythical, common in the 12th and 13th centuries. The vellum pages were thick and beautifully preserved, the text written in a formal Gothic hand, but it was the illuminations that caught my attention immediately. Every margin was filled with images of wolves, not the stylized symbolic wolves common in medieval art, but wolves rendered with disturbing anatomical precision. And each one wore ecclesiastical vestments, bishops' mitres, cardinals' red hats, papal tiaras. Their eyes were painted with gold leaf that caught the candlelight, making them seem almost luminous. I photographed the closed manuscript, as instructed, then carefully opened the glass case. The smell of old vellum and iron gall ink rose up, familiar, comforting. I began my assessment, checking for signs of deterioration, insect damage, or environmental stress. The manuscript was in perfect condition, impossibly perfect, given its age. I was documenting the binding structure when I noticed something odd about one of the margin illustrations, a wolf wearing a bishop's mitre on the page describing domestic dogs. Its head was turned slightly toward the center of the page, as if looking at the text. I remembered my training. Margin illustrations in medieval manuscripts often interacted with the main text, commentary through image. But when I turned to the next page and then looked back, the wolf's head had moved, just slightly. Now it appeared to be looking toward the right edge of the page, toward me. I stepped back from the table, my heart suddenly loud in the stone silence. I told myself I was imagining it. The candlelight was flickering, creating the illusion of movement. Medieval artists were skilled at trompe-l'oeil effects. I returned to my work, photographing each page systematically, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every wolf in every margin seemed aware of my presence. Their gold leaf eyes caught the light at angles that shouldn't have been possible from painted surfaces. On the 7th page, I found a wolf wearing a cardinal's hat. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth painted in meticulous detail. I photographed it, checked my camera to ensure the image was sharp, then turned the page. When I glanced back at the previous page, still visible as the vellum was thin, the wolf's mouth had closed. My hands started to shake. I set down my camera and consulted the instructions from the red folder. Do not turn your back to the manuscript. The rule suddenly made terrible sense. I continued the assessment, but now I was watching the illustrations as much as documenting them, and they were moving, not dramatically, not in the way of animation or hallucination, but with the subtle shifts of living things trying to remain still, a head turning a few degrees, eyes tracking, a paw repositioning. The wolves were watching me work. I found myself reading the Latin text, looking for explanations. The bestiary described each animal's nature and its spiritual symbolism, but the entries for wolves were different from standard bestiaries I'd studied. They didn't discuss the wolf's loyalty or ferocity. Instead, they described wolves that learned to walk upright, wolves that studied human speech, wolves that coveted shepherd's clothing. One passage illuminated with a particularly large wolf in a bishop's mitre, translated roughly, there are those who enter through the door, and those who climb the walls. The latter shed their nature, but never their appetites. They learn our prayers but hunger still for the flock. I checked my watch. 3:45. Still time before Vespers. But I wanted to finish. The chamber felt smaller than when I'd entered. The stone walls closer. The candlelight dimmer, despite the flame burning steady. On the final pages, I found something that wasn't in the catalog description. A section at the end of the bestiary, after all the animal entries, written in a different hand, older, more hurried. The Latin was harder to parse, the spelling irregular. It was a list of names, not animal names, human names. Cardinals and bishops. Some I recognized from history. Innocent III, Boniface VIII, names from the 13th and 14th centuries. And next to each name, a small illustration of a wolf wearing that person's specific ecclesiastical insignia. I was leaning close to photograph this section when I realized the room had grown completely silent, not the normal silence of an underground chamber, but an active, waiting silence, the kind that presses against your ears. I looked up at the manuscript. Every wolf on every visible page had turned its head to face me directly. Their mouths were open now, all of them, showing painted teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. The gold leaf eyes reflected the candlelight, but the reflections didn't move when I moved. They stayed fixed, tracking. I remembered the rule. Do not turn your back to the manuscript. I gathered my equipment slowly, never taking my eyes off the pages. The wolves didn't move, but I could feel their attention like a physical weight. I had the horrible sense that they were waiting for something, for me to turn away. for me to break protocol, for the bells to ring. I placed my camera in my bag, still watching the manuscript. The wolves seemed to lean forward slightly in their margins, their vestments painted with such precision. I could see the individual threads in the fabric, the jewels in the miters. I picked up the candle with my left hand, my bag with my right. I walked backward toward the door, keeping the manuscript in view. My hand found the doorknob. The copper was ice cold. As I stepped across the threshold, just before I closed the door, I saw the wolves on the nearest page turn their heads in unison, not toward me anymore, toward the back of the chamber, toward the darkness beyond the candlelight's reach, where the stone walls disappeared into shadow, toward something I couldn't see, but they clearly could. I locked the door and climbed the stairs faster than I should have, the candle flame streaming behind me. Father Domenico was waiting at the top, his expression unchanged. "You followed the protocols," he said, not a question. "Yes." He nodded and led me back through the Borgia apartments in silence. When we reached the modern sections of the Vatican, he paused. "The chamber is accessed once every 5 years," he said quietly, "for condition assessments only. The manuscript must be verified, but never read completely, never removed, never copied beyond photographic documentation." "Why?" He looked at me with eyes that had seen more years in the Vatican than I could imagine. "Because some knowledge is not meant to be possessed, Miss Malik, only witnessed and contained." I submitted my report the next day. Monsignor Catalano read it, nodded, and placed it in the red folder without comment. He didn't ask about my experience. He didn't ask if I'd noticed anything unusual. He simply said, "Your next assessment of Codex Leporum will be in 2028, 5 years from now." I've tried not to think about the manuscript, about the wolves in their holy vestments, about the list of names, but sometimes, during afternoon prayers in the Archives chapel, I find myself studying the faces of the older priests and monsignors, trying to see what the medieval scribe saw, trying to understand what required 700 years of containment. And sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake with the certainty that something is watching me from the margins of my vision, waiting patiently in the spaces where candlelight doesn't reach. The Vatican has always had protocols for things we don't discuss, rules that seem arbitrary, until you understand their necessity. Don't turn your back. Exit before the bells. Access only at appointed times. Some manuscripts are not archived for preservation, but for containment. And 40 meters below the basilica, in a chamber built for a single codex, the wolves are still watching, still wearing their stolen vestments, still waiting, I think, for someone to forget the protocols, still hungry for the flock. Some relics are catalogued not for veneration, but for containment. My name is Anton Kress, and I've served as assistant curator for the Vatican Museum's Sacred Reliquary Collection since 2018. It's quiet work, mostly administrative, managing loans to dioceses, authenticating provenances, maintaining climate controls for objects that have survived centuries through careful stewardship. I catalog fragments of the true cross, files of saints' blood, bones wrapped in silk and gold. These are objects of devotion, yes, but also historical artifacts, requiring the same methodical care as any museum piece. The work suits my temperament. I'm not particularly devout. My faith is academic rather than spiritual, but I respect the weight these objects carry for believers. I handle them with reverence, document them with precision, and maintain the protocols established long before my arrival. In September of 2024, Cardinal Vittori requested a complete inventory of Collection 7, a series of storage rooms beneath the Museo Pio Cristiano, that house reliquaries deemed too fragile or obscure for display. Some hadn't been opened since the 1930s. The Cardinal wanted everything photographed, catalogued, and assessed for potential conservation needs before the upcoming Holy Year. I began the inventory on a Tuesday. The storage rooms were accessed through a corridor behind the lapidary gallery, down 2 flights of stairs that still bore medieval stonework. Each room required 2 keys, one held by the museum director, one by the Secretariat for the Economy, standard protocol for valuable collections. The first 3 rooms contained exactly what I expected: reliquaries from closed monasteries, duplicate items from larger collections, objects with incomplete provenances that couldn't be displayed but were too historically significant to dispose of. I worked systematically, photographing each piece, recording dimensions and conditions, updating our digital database. It was in the 4th room, on my 2nd day, that I found the collar. It sat in a plain wooden box, unmarked except for a number painted in faded white, 743. The box itself was 19th century, but the collar inside was much older, medieval, perhaps 13th or 14th century, made of copper that had oxidized to a deep green. It was sized for a large dog, with a simple buckle closure and a flat plate riveted to the front. The plate bore an inscription in Latin, engraved in Gothic script: Proprietas Card, Giancarlo Torriani, Anno Domini MCCX Favin, property of Cardinal Giancarlo Torriani, year of our Lord, 1317. I'd catalogued stranger items: a splinter supposedly from Noah's Ark, a cloth bearing the tears of Mary Magdalene. But something about this object unsettled me. Why would a cardinal's dog collar be stored with sacred relics? And why was there no accompanying documentation, no provenance card, no reference number that connected it to our existing records? I photographed it from every angle, measured it precisely, noted the oxidation patterns and the style of engraving. Then I returned it to its box and continued with the inventory. But that evening, at home, I found myself searching our archives for Giancarlo Torriani. He existed, born in 1278 in Bergamo, elevated to cardinal by Pope John XXII in 1317, the same year as the collar's inscription. He served on the Curia for the papal court in Avignon, then returned to Rome when the papacy relocated in 1377. He died in 1389, at what the records indicated was the remarkable age of 111. Except the numbers didn't align. If he'd been elevated to cardinal at approximately 40, the typical age for such appointments, he would have been born around 1277 or 1278. That would make him 111 or 112 at death, possible, but extraordinarily rare for the 14th century. I requested access to the Apostolic Archives visual materials collection. It took 3 days to receive approval, but eventually I was permitted to view the portfolio of historical portraits in their climate-controlled vault. There were 4 paintings of Cardinal Torriani. The first, dated 1320, showed a man who appeared to be in his early 40s, dark hair, strong features, the robust health of someone in their prime. The second, from 1345, showed the same man, seemingly unchanged. The third, painted in 1362, was identical in every detail except the richness of his vestments. The fourth and final portrait, completed just 2 years before his death in 1387, showed a man who looked perhaps 50 years old, 67 years of service, and he'd aged perhaps 10 years in appearance. I returned to collection 7 the next morning. The collar sat in its box exactly as I'd left it, but now I examined it with different eyes. The copper was worn smooth on the inside, as if from decades of use. The buckle showed the patina of countless fastenings and unfastenings. This was not a ceremonial object or a curiosity. It had been worn regularly for a long time. I checked the inventory number against our master catalog. 743 appeared in a handwritten ledger from 1896 with a single notation. Transferred from sealed archives. Apostolic Palace. No exhibition. No loan. Restricted access. By episcopal approval only. That afternoon, I submitted a formal inquiry to the Apostolic Archive, requesting any documentation related to Cardinal Torriani's cause for canonization. Vatican procedure requires that all cardinals who serve with distinction be considered for sainthood, their lives examined, their writings reviewed, witnesses interviewed about potential miracles. The response came back within hours, which itself was unusual. The inquiry had been noted and logged, but no documents would be provided. Cardinal Torriani's cause had been initiated in 1412, but abandoned in 1418, with no formal conclusion recorded. I should have stopped there. My job was inventory, not investigation, but something about those portraits, the unchanging face, the steady gaze across 7 decades, had lodged itself in my mind. That night, I woke at 3:17 in the morning with absolute clarity about what I needed to do. I would examine the collar more carefully. The inscription mentioned only the year of its creation, but perhaps there were other markings, other details I'd missed in my initial documentation. The next day was Friday. I waited until the afternoon, when the storage rooms were emptiest, and returned to collection 7 with my camera and magnifying equipment. The collar's inner surface, I discovered, bore scratches, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, worn into the copper over time. Not random. They formed patterns, letters, Latin phrases scratched into the metal by something sharp, something that had worn the collar for long enough to leave messages in the only way available. Misere me, have mercy on me. Libera me, free me. Quis sum? Who am I? The scratches grew, more frantic toward the buckle, overlapping and illegible, but one phrase appeared repeatedly, carved deeper than the others, with the desperate precision of something that needed to be remembered. Eram homo. I was photographing these markings when I heard footsteps in the corridor. Instinctively, I closed the box and stepped back from the shelf. Father Domenico appeared in the doorway, one of the Secretariat priests who managed access to the restricted collections. He was perhaps 60, with the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent decades keeping Vatican secrets. Curator Kress, he said. I wasn't informed you'd be working late. Just finishing documentation for Cardinal Vittori's inventory. I kept my voice steady, professional. He looked at the closed box, then at me. Item 743. Yes, Father. That item has been recatalogued, he said. It's been moved to a different collection. I'll need to retrieve it now. It's not listed as moved in my inventory sheets. The decision was made this morning. By Cardinal Vittori himself. Father Domenico moved past me and picked up the box. Your inventory of Collection 7 is complete. The Cardinal thanks you for your thorough work. He left before I could respond, taking the collar with him. I returned to my office and checked my email. There was indeed a message from Cardinal Vittori's office, time-stamped from that morning, before I'd returned to examine the collar. The message thanked me for completing the inventory and noted that certain items require additional conservation assessment and have been transferred accordingly. No mention of which items. No explanation of the timing. That was 6 weeks ago. I completed my inventory report without including item 743, as instructed. Cardinal Vittori accepted the documentation without comment. The storage rooms were sealed again, their contents secured for another decade at least. But I've spent these weeks researching what I can within the boundaries of my access. Cardinal Torriani left behind extensive writings, theological treatises, administrative correspondence, personal journals. None of it is digitized. All of it remains in the Apostolic Archives restricted sections, available only to approved scholars conducting approved research. I did find one reference, though, in a secondary source, a 20th century historian's mention of a curious tradition at the papal court in Avignon. Certain cardinals, the historian wrote, were said to have kept large hounds as companions, unusually intelligent animals that accompanied them everywhere, and were afforded strange privileges. The tradition apparently died out when the papacy returned to Rome, and no contemporary sources explain its origin or purpose. Last week, Father Domenico stopped by my office. He didn't mention the collar or Collection 7. He simply left a folder on my desk. Transfer orders for a new position. I'm being promoted to senior curator at the Vatican Library's Manuscript Conservation Department. Excellent salary, prestigious work, an office in the Apostolic Palace itself. The position starts in January. I've already accepted because some knowledge I've learned comes with a price, and the Vatican always pays its debts. I still wake sometimes at 3:17, thinking about those scratched words, eram homo. I was a man. Present tense implies past tense, implies something changed, implies a transformation that lasted 60 years while portraits recorded an unchanging face. I think about service and devotion, about what the Church might ask of its most faithful servants, about loyalty that transcends the human lifespan and the forms that loyalty might take. And I wonder, in my new position, with its prestigious office and its access to restricted archives, what I'm being prepared for, what knowledge I'm being trusted with, what collar, perhaps, I'm being fitted for. Some relics are catalogued, not for veneration, but for containment. Others are catalogued as warnings, and some, I think, are catalogued as invitations. There are hours when even the Vatican's eyes must close, and we are instructed never to ask why. My name is Mira Ghosh, and I've been a security systems analyst for the Holy See since 2019. I'm not clergy. I'm a contractor from Mumbai who specialized in digital surveillance infrastructure before the Vatican hired me to modernize their security network. It's technical work, mostly remote, reviewing camera feeds and server logs from an office in the Governator building. The priests appreciate that I'm efficient and quiet. I appreciate that they pay well and ask few questions about my lack of religious affiliation. The Vatican's security system is vast. Over 1,000 cameras monitoring museums, archives, gardens, and administrative buildings. Most of it is newer equipment I helped install, but certain sections still run on analog systems from the 1980s and 90s. My job includes integrating these older feeds into our digital network and ensuring no gaps in coverage. In September of 2024, I noticed an anomaly in the patrol logs. 7 corridors in the Apostolic Palace, all connected to the residential wing near the papal apartments, showed consistent blackout periods between 3 and 4 a.m. every single night. Complete signal loss on all cameras, analog and digital, for exactly 1 hour. I assumed it was an electrical issue, old wiring perhaps, or a timer system I hadn't been briefed on. I filed a maintenance request with Father DeSantis, the priest who managed security operations. He came to my office the next morning. Father DeSantis was in his 60s, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades navigating Vatican bureaucracy. He reviewed my report in silence, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "This is a known issue," he said. "The maintenance team is aware. Should I route backup coverage from adjacent cameras during the blackout period?" "No." He set down my report. "The corridors are not to be monitored during those hours. It's been this way since the current system was installed, but that's a significant security gap, Miss Gosh." His voice remained gentle, but something in it made me stop. Some protocols exist for reasons beyond security. This is one of them. Please don't file additional reports on this matter. I should have left it alone. In my 5 years with the Vatican, I'd learned that certain questions were politely but firmly discouraged. But I'm an analyst by training and temperament. I see patterns, and I need them to make sense. That night, I accessed the archived footage from the 7 corridors, not the current feeds, but the historical recordings stored in our backup servers. We kept 40 years of footage, everything since the security system had been digitized in 1984. I started with a random date, March 15th, 2010. I fast-forwarded to 3 a.m. The feeds showed empty corridors, night lighting, everything normal. Then, at exactly 3:01 a.m., all 7 cameras went to static simultaneously. I watched the static for several minutes, about to skip ahead when I saw it, a shape in the interference. Just for a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. A figure moving through the visual noise. Hunched, its proportions subtly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Moving down the corridor toward the residential wing. Then the static cleared at 4 a.m. and the corridors were empty again. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. But I checked another date, then another. October 23rd, 2016. January 7th, 1999. June 12th, 2022. The blackouts occurred every night, but the figure only appeared in certain recordings. I started noting which dates showed the shape in the static, and within an hour I'd found the pattern. Full moons. Every recording made on a night of the full moon showed the same hunched figure moving through the same 7 corridors during the blackout hour, always traveling in the same direction, toward the papal apartments. I pulled footage going back to 1984, the oldest recordings in our system. The figure was there too. Same posture, same movement pattern, same destination. 40 years of monthly appearances, documented in static and interference, never mentioned in any security report I could find. My hands were shaking as I checked the lunar calendar. The next full moon was in 4 days. I knew I should stop looking. Father DeSantis had been clear, but I couldn't unsee what I'd found. Something moved through those corridors every full moon during the hour when cameras went blind. Something that had been doing so for at least 4 decades, possibly longer. The next morning, I went to the archives in the Apostolic Palace, the administrative records, not the famous library tourist visit. I requested maintenance logs for the security system, specifically the installation reports from 1984. The archivist, a young priest named Father Matteo, brought me a red-stamped folder after an hour's search. Red stamps, I'd learned, indicated sensitive materials, not secret in the classified sense, but documents requiring discretion. The installation report was routine until I reached the final page. A handwritten addendum, dated November 19th, 1984, signed by a Cardinal Toretti, whom I'd never heard of. Established protocol dating to 1873. Cameras in corridors, 4B through 4H. Residential wing, 3rd floor, are to be disabled between 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock daily. This hour is not to be monitored or recorded by any means. Night guards are not to patrol these corridors during this period. This protocol supersedes all standard security procedures and is not subject to review or modification. 1873. More than 100 years before the security cameras existed, whatever happened in those corridors during that hour had been accommodated long before anyone could record it. I photographed the document with my phone before Father Matteo returned to collect the folder. He noticed my expression. "Are you well, Miss Gosh?" "The protocol from 1873, I said. "Do you know what it refers to?" His face changed. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who knows they're standing at a boundary they shouldn't cross. "There are many old protocols," he said carefully. "The church is 2,000 years old. Some traditions are maintained, even when we don't understand why, especially then." The night of the full moon, I stayed late in my office. I told myself I was catching up on routine work, but I kept one monitor showing the 7 corridors. At 2:55 a.m., the feeds were normal. Empty hallways, night lighting, casting long shadows from doorways and alcoves. At 3:01 a.m., all 7 screens dissolved into static simultaneously. I'd prepared for this. I had audio recording equipment ready, electromagnetic field readers, even a thermal camera pointed at one of the monitors. If something was causing the interference, I'd document it properly. But as I watched the static, I realized my equipment was meaningless. This wasn't a technical malfunction I could diagnose. The interference was too uniform, too precise. And in the visual noise, I could see it forming. The hunched figure. It moved slowly through the static of the first corridor, then the second. On my monitor, it was just a shape, a darker density in the gray interference. But I knew, somehow, that it was moving through the actual corridors right now. That if I walked to the residential wing at this moment, I would find those 7 hallways empty and dark, and filled with something that had been walking them for more than 150 years. The figure progressed through each corridor in sequence. I could track its movement across my 7 monitors as it traveled toward the papal apartments. Its posture was wrong in ways I still can't describe. The proportions human but subtly incorrect. The movement purposeful but unnatural. At 3:47 a.m., it reached the final corridor, the one that ended at the entrance to the residential wing where the Pope himself slept. Then it stopped. For 13 minutes, it remained motionless in the static, a hunched, dark shape at the threshold. I watched, my breath shallow, every rational part of my mind screaming that this was impossible, while the evidence flickered across 7 screens in front of me. At exactly 4 a.m., The static cleared, all 7 corridors empty. Night lighting, unchanged. Everything normal. I sat in my office until dawn, then went home and slept for 3 hours. When I returned, Father DeSantis was waiting in my office. "You were here during the blackout last night," he said. Not a question. I didn't ask how he knew. "Yes. Did you observe the feeds?" I could have lied. Should have lied, but I was too tired and too unsettled. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down across from my desk, and I saw that he looked as tired as I felt. "The Holy Father is aware," he said finally. "Every pope has been aware since 1773. Before cameras, there were night guards who were instructed not to patrol during that hour. Before that, priests who kept vigil in the chapel nearby and knew to remain at prayer. The protocol has been maintained because it works." "What works? What is it?" "We don't ask that question, Miss Gosh. We maintain the protocol. 1 hour, 7 corridors, every night. It walks them, and it stops at the threshold, and it never enters. That is the arrangement. Arrangement with what?" Father DeSantis stood. "Your contract will be reassigned to the museum security systems. Effective immediately. Someone else will monitor the Apostolic Palace feeds." He left before I could respond. I wanted to refuse, to demand explanations. But I'd seen enough to know that some things in the Vatican were older than understanding, maintained not through faith, but through careful, fearful precedent. I transferred to museum security the next week. I never monitored those 7 corridors again, but sometimes I still check the lunar calendar, and on nights of the full moon, I wake at 3:17 and lie in the dark, thinking of that hunched figure walking its appointed route, approaching the threshold of the papal apartments and stopping. Always stopping, waiting for something, or keeping watch over something. An arrangement maintained for more than 150 years, accommodated by every pope, every security system, every technological advance. 1 hour of blindness, deliberately preserved. I don't work for the Vatican anymore. I left Rome last month, returned to Mumbai, took a position with a corporate security firm. Normal buildings, normal surveillance, normal problems. But last week, a colleague mentioned seeing something odd in our parking garage footage, a figure in the static during a brief power outage. He laughed about it. "Pareidolia," he said. "I didn't tell him to check the lunar calendar. I didn't tell him anything at all. Some protocols exist for reasons we shouldn't pursue. Some hours are meant to remain unwatched. And some things walk the corridors of our most sacred places, following paths older than our cameras, our understanding, or our courage to ask why. There are prayers in the Vatican that begin but never conclude, and vigils that cannot be abandoned without consequence. My name is Jen Archambault, and I've spent 23 years restoring sacred art across Europe. I specialize in fresco recovery, the painstaking work of revealing images buried beneath centuries of overpainting, plaster, and institutional forgetting. It's solitary work that requires patience and reverence. You learn to read the layers of a wall like a manuscript, understanding that what was covered was often covered for a reason. In September of 2023, I was contracted by the Vatican's Fabric of St. Peter to work in the Chapel of St. Hubert, a small oratory in the Vatican's northern wing that hadn't been used for regular services since the 19th century. The space had been storage for decades, wooden crates, rolled carpets, broken furniture from other chapels. The commission wanted it cleared and assessed for possible restoration. Father DeSanto met me on my first morning. He was perhaps 60, with the deliberate movements of someone who'd spent a lifetime following protocol. He unlocked 3 separate doors to reach the chapel, each requiring a different key from a ring he wore on his belt. The chapel was built in 1437, he explained as we entered, dedicated to Saint Hubert by a German cardinal whose name isn't recorded in our archives. It was used primarily by visiting prelates from the Germanic regions. He gestured at the walls, which were covered in dingy plaster, painted a bureaucratic beige. We believe there may be original frescoes beneath. Your job is to determine what can be recovered. The chapel was perhaps 8 meters long and 5 wide, with a simple altar and 6 pews. 2 narrow windows provided minimal light. The air smelled of dust and old incense, that particular scent of spaces where prayer has accumulated like sediment. You'll work alone, Father DeSanto continued. The wing is being renovated, so there may be construction noise, but no one else will enter this section. I'll check on your progress each evening at 6. He paused at the door. There's one unusual detail in the historical records. The chapel apparently required a continuous vigil, a priest in prayer at all hours. The practice was discontinued in 1891 when the assigned priest died and wasn't replaced. No explanation given for why it was necessary. I spent the first 2 days documenting and clearing the space. The plaster was thick and applied hastily, as if someone had wanted to cover the walls quickly rather than properly. When I began testing for frescoes beneath, I found them almost immediately, traces of pigment, the ghost of images pressed into the original surface. I started on the north wall, using careful chemical treatments to soften and remove the overpainting. By the 3rd day, I'd revealed the upper corner of a scene, a forest rendered in the International Gothic style, with detailed trees and a suggestion of sky. The colors were remarkably preserved, deep greens and browns, touches of gold leaf. The image emerged slowly over the next week. A hunting scene, as expected for a chapel dedicated to Saint Hubert. A figure in medieval dress, haloed, holding a crossbow. The forest around him was dense and dark, painted with an attention to shadow that seemed unusual for devotional art. On the 9th day, I uncovered what the saint was aiming at. Not a stag, not the traditional imagery of Hubert's conversion, where he sees the crucifix between the antlers of a white deer and hears God's call to holiness. This was something else. The figure was man-shaped, upright, with human proportions, but its head was crowned with antlers that branched like a diseased tree. The artist had painted it partially hidden behind trees, so only fragments were visible: a shoulder, part of the torso, those impossible antlers. The technique created an optical effect. The longer I looked, the harder it became to determine where the figure ended and the forest began. Beneath the scene, in Gothic script, was text in medieval German. I photographed it and sent it to a translator colleague in Munich. She called me that evening. "Jean, where did you find this?" Her voice was uncertain. "The text says, 'Some saints hunt forever. Some hunts have no end. Pray for the hunter and the hunted both.'" I worked on revealing more of the fresco over the following days. The forest scene continued along the entire north wall, wrapping partway around the east and west walls. Everywhere, there were suggestions of the antlered figure, never fully visible, always fragmentary, painted in a way that made it seem to be moving through the trees just ahead of the saint. On the east wall, I found a second image of Saint Hubert, and then a third. Each showed him at a different point in the forest, his crossbow always raised, always aimed at something just out of frame. The progression suggested passage of time. His clothes became more tattered, his face more gaunt. In the final image, on the west wall, his halo had faded to barely visible, and something about his posture suggested exhaustion rather than holy determination. I began to notice the chapel's silence. The construction noise Father DeSanto had mentioned never materialized. The northern wing was utterly quiet, even during what should have been working hours. When I stepped into the corridor during breaks, I saw no one. The lights were on, the building was maintained, but I never encountered another person except Father DeSanto during his evening visits. The fresco is remarkable, I told him on the 13th day, but the imagery is unusual. Saint Hubert appears to be hunting something that isn't the traditional stag. Father DeSanto studied my documentation for a long moment. Continue the work, he said. Record everything. Shouldn't the iconography be reviewed? This doesn't match any standard depiction of record everything, he repeated, with the same finality I'd heard before in Vatican officials. The tone that meant certain questions had no answers. You were permitted to hear. That night, I dreamed of forests, of walking between trees that were too close together, their branches forming a ceiling that blocked all sky, of something moving parallel to me, just out of sight, its footsteps perfectly synchronized with mine, so I could never tell if I was following it or it was following me. I woke at 3:17 in the morning, my heart racing, with the absolute conviction that I needed to return to the chapel. I dressed and drove to the Vatican. The guards at the entrance recognized me and waved me through without comment. Apparently, Father DeSanto had authorized round-the-clock access. The northern wing was dark, except for emergency lighting. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. The chapel door was unlocked. Inside, my work lights were off, but the space wasn't completely dark. The two narrow windows admitted moonlight that fell across the frescoes I'd uncovered. In that light, the images looked different. The antlered figure was more visible, not because I'd revealed more of the fresco, but because the shadows were different. The moonlight catching details I hadn't noticed in artificial light. I could see its face now, or the suggestion of one. Almost human. Almost. And Saint Hubert, in each progressive image, looked less like he was hunting, and more like he was fleeing. His crossbow wasn't aimed ahead, but back, over his shoulder. The expression I'd interpreted as determination was actually terror. I heard a sound from the corridor, footsteps, slow and measured, not the quick pace of someone walking normally, but the deliberate rhythm of a processional or a vigil. The footsteps stopped outside the chapel door. I stood frozen, my phone's flashlight illuminating the fresco. In its beam, I saw something I'd missed, a detail in the final image of Saint Hubert. His hand, the one not holding the crossbow, was raised in a gesture I recognized from other medieval art. Not a blessing, a warning. The door opened. Father DeSanto entered, dressed in a cassock I hadn't seen him wear before. Older, simpler, the kind worn for private devotions rather than public ministry. He was carrying a rosary and a book bound in dark leather. He looked at me, then at the fresco, and something in his face told me he'd known what I would find, that he'd always known. The vigil, he said quietly, was not for the chapel. It was for what the chapel contains. The prayer that keeps the hunt contained to these walls, to this image. For 500 years, there was always someone here, maintaining the boundary between the painted forest and the world outside. I don't understand. In 1437, a cardinal brought something back from the forests of Bavaria. Something that wore the shape of a man, but was not a man. Something that had been hunted by saints and hermits for centuries, driven from one sacred space to another. The cardinal commissioned this chapel and hired an artist who knew how to paint prayers, how to trap things in pigment and plaster. Father De Santo set his book on the nearest pew. When the vigil ended in 1891, they covered the frescoes. Thought that would be enough, but certain bindings weaken over time, especially when the prayers that maintain them are neglected. I looked at the fresco again, at the forest that seemed darker than it had been, at the saint who was running, at the figure with antlers that was no longer fragmentary, but almost whole, almost visible, almost. "You should go," Father De Santo said. He was opening his book, finding a marked page. "I'll be here until morning, and tomorrow someone else will come. We're restoring the vigil, continuous prayer, as it was meant to be. And the fresco will be covered again. More carefully this time." He glanced at my cameras, my documentation. "Your work here is finished. The commission will compensate you fully and provide a confidentiality agreement. The chapel will be sealed until we're certain the binding is secure." I wanted to argue, to demand explanations that made sense, but I could feel it now. The sensation I'd mistaken for solitude all these days. Not emptiness, but attention. Something watching from the painted forest, waiting to see if the boundary would hold. Father De Santo began to pray in Latin, his voice steady and low. The words weren't from any liturgy. I recognized. I gathered my equipment and left. In the corridor, I looked back once. Through the doorway, I saw Father De Santo kneeling before the fresco, his rosary moving through his fingers, his voice continuing the prayer. Behind him, in the moonlit image on the wall, something among the painted trees shifted position. The hunt continues. I understood then. Some saints pursue forever, and what they pursue cannot be killed or escaped, only contained, only held in the borders of sacred images, in chapels where prayer never ceases, where the vigil is maintained without end. They sealed the chapel of St. Hubert. 3 weeks later, I received my payment and signed documents. I didn't fully read. I never restored sacred art for the Vatican again. But sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake with the certainty that I'm standing in a forest that exists only in paint and prayer, and I hear footsteps, slow and measured, the rhythm of an eternal vigil, keeping watch over a hunt that can never conclude. Some saints pursue forever, and what they hunt waits in the spaces between prayer and silence, between image and reality, patient as only immortal things can be. The Vatican maintains the vigil now. I don't ask how or who prays there or what happens if they stop. There are some answers that would require me to understand what I saw in that moonlit chapel, and understanding would mean acknowledging that the forests in medieval paintings are not always metaphors, that some images are not art but cages, and that certain hunts can never end, because ending them would release something that has been running from sanctity for longer than the Church has existed to contain it. Some assignments are not recorded in the personnel registry, and some parishes receive communion wafers that must never be consecrated. My name is Carmen Ruiz, and I've served as a research historian in the Vatican's secret archives, now called the Apostolic Archives, though we still use the old name among ourselves, since 2011. My specialty is ecclesiastical legal history, specifically the trial records of the Inquisition. I've read thousands of pages documenting heresy trials, witch prosecutions, and theological disputes. The Church's relationship with the accused is always carefully documented, always procedurally precise. We kept better records than any secular court of the era. In September of 2023, I was cataloging a collection of 16th century documents from the Roman Inquisition when I found a leather portfolio I didn't recognize. It was filed incorrectly, placed among routine heresy cases from 1568, but the portfolio itself was marked 1573. The leather was water-stained, and someone had sealed it with red wax that bore no official stamp, just a smooth, blank surface. Inside were 12 trial transcripts, each perhaps 30 pages, written in the formal Latin used for inquisitorial proceedings. The charges were listed identically in each case: acceptance of the other Eucharist and transubstantiation of the contrary form. I'd never encountered those specific charges before, and I've read trials covering every imaginable heresy. All 12 defendants were clergy: 2 bishops, 7 priests, 3 deacons. Their trials had taken place over 6 months in 1573, in different cities: Rome, Florence, Lyon, Cologne. Yet the testimonies described remarkably similar experiences. Each defendant confessed to consuming what they called the other sacrament during a mass held in wilderness locations, always on nights when the moon was full. They described a chalice that was passed among them, though they wouldn't specify its contents. They spoke of a transformation afterward, not of bread and wine into flesh and blood, but of their own flesh into something else. The trial records used the Latin word lupus repeatedly, but always in a theological context, never a literal one. What disturbed me most was the absence of executions. The Inquisition burned heretics. Excommunication and death were standard for offenses far less serious than whatever these men had confessed to. Yet every transcript ended the same way. The defendant was found guilty, stripped of their public ministry, and reassigned to parishes of perpetual night duty, where their particular charism might be properly supervised and contained. Each transcript included the name of their new assignment: Parish of San Cristoforo, in eternal shade; Parish of Our Lady of Lightless Mercy; Parish of the Perpetual Vigil. 12 parishes, none of which I'd ever encountered in any historical record. I spent 3 days searching for references to these locations. Nothing in the geographical archives, nothing in the diocesan records. I checked every map of 16th century Catholic territories. These parishes existed nowhere except in these trial documents and their reassignment orders. Then I made a mistake. I checked the current personnel database. The Vatican maintains meticulous financial records. Every priest, every parish, every monthly stipend is documented. I entered the parish names on impulse, expecting nothing. All 12 parishes were listed as active. Each one had a single priest assigned, no other staff, no congregation size listed, no physical address, just a name and a monthly stipend that had been paid without interruption since 1573. 450 years of continuous payment to parishes that don't exist on any map. I brought my findings to Monsignor Tassari, the archive's administrative director. He's 73, from a small village in Umbria, and he's worked in the archives since before I was born. I've never seen him surprised by anything we've uncovered. He read through my documentation in silence, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "You'll seal these transcripts in the restricted collection," he said quietly. "Category 7. No catalog entry." "But Monsignor," The financial records show these parishes are still receiving. Dr. Ruiz. His voice was gentle, but absolute. Some administrative continuities are maintained for reasons that exceed historical curiosity. The stipends are paid. The parishes are served. That is sufficient. Who are we paying? Those priests would be. The payments are made to parish accounts, not individuals. How those accounts are administered is not our concern. He stood, signaling the conversation's end. The transcripts will be sealed by evening. I'll handle the reclassification myself. I should have left it alone. I'd been given a direct instruction by a superior, but that night, at home, I couldn't stop thinking about those parish names. Lightless, perpetual night, eternal shade. The language suggested something specific, something literal. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke with an idea. I opened my laptop and searched the Vatican's property records, not for the parishes themselves, but for land acquisitions made in 1573, the year of the trials. I found them. 12 properties, purchased, within weeks of each other. Remote locations throughout Europe, forests in Germany, mountain valleys in Switzerland, cave systems in southern Italy. Each property was listed as ecclesiastical administrative use with no further description. Each one was still owned by the Holy See. The property records included GPS coordinates. I spent the rest of that night on mapping software, examining satellite imagery of each location. Most were heavily forested areas with no visible structures, but 3 of them. 3 showed something, not churches or buildings, clearings. Small, perfectly circular clearings in otherwise dense forest, each perhaps 20 meters across. The trees surrounding them cast shadows that even in the satellite photos seemed to bend inward as if pulled toward the center. In one image, taken during what appeared to be late afternoon based on the sun angle, I could see something in the clearing's center, a figure perhaps, too blurred to be certain, but roughly man-sized and oddly postured, as though crouched or prostrate. I zoomed in, as far as the software allowed. The figure's shadow was wrong. It extended in the opposite direction from all the other shadows in the image, pointing toward the sun instead of away from it. The next morning, I returned to the archives with a list of questions I knew I shouldn't ask. Monsignor Tessari was waiting in my office. He wasn't alone. 2 priests I didn't recognize stood with him. Both younger men in plain black cassocks, with no identifying insignia. Dr. Ruiz, the Monsignor said, you've been granted a brief sabbatical, 3 months. Paid, of course. You'll want to visit your family in Barcelona. I think, spend time away from the documents. It wasn't a suggestion. I was just doing research. We know. One of the unnamed priests spoke, his Italian inflected with something Eastern European. We monitor access to certain financial databases. The property searches triggered a notification. I don't understand what. Some assignments predate current administrative structures, the other priest said. His voice was surprisingly gentle. They were established under authorities that no longer formally exist, but whose arrangements the Church honors. Continuity of certain obligations. You understand. I didn't understand, but I recognized a warning when I heard one. The transcripts. I asked. Already relocated, Monsignor Tessari said. You've done excellent work, Carmen. Take your sabbatical. When you return, you'll find a new project waiting. 17th century papal correspondence. much more suitable. They walked me out of the building that afternoon. The unnamed priests were polite but insistent. I was given a phone number to call if I needed anything during my sabbatical, a Vatican exchange that, when I later checked, didn't exist in any directory. I've been back for 2 months now. The 17th century correspondence is genuine work, and I've tried to focus on it. But twice now, I've woken at 3:17 in the morning, with the certainty that I'm being watched. Last week, I received a letter at my apartment, no return address, postmarked from a small village in the Bavarian Alps. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Latin. The masses continue. It read, "The other sacrament is administered. We maintain our vigil in the places without light, and we pray for those who must not know the full nature of our service. Some transformations serve the Church. Some hungers are sanctified." It was signed with 12 names, the same 12 names from the trial transcripts. I burned the letter. I've told no one about it. But I can't stop thinking about those clearings, those shadows pointing the wrong direction, those monthly payments sent to parishes that exist on no map. The Church maintains certain obligations, continuities that predate our understanding, and somewhere in lightless clearings throughout Europe, in parishes of perpetual night duty, 12 assignments are still being fulfilled. Masses are still being said. A different kind of communion is still being served. I don't search the financial databases anymore. I don't look at satellite imagery, but sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I find myself wondering what kind of mass requires darkness, what kind of transformation the Church found useful enough to sustain for 450 years. What other sacrament 12 priests agreed to receive, and what they became in service to it. They gave me 3 days in that chamber, though I didn't know it would be exactly 3 when I started. My name is Elena Corvino. For 14 years, I've restored sacred art throughout Italy, mostly Renaissance work, occasionally Byzantine pieces that require the delicate touch of someone who understands how pigment behaves after centuries of candle smoke and incense. I've worked in cathedrals from Milan to Palermo. I've cleaned altarpieces that hadn't been touched since Napoleonic soldiers used them for target practice. But I'd never worked directly for the Vatican until February of 2024, when the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology contacted me about San Clemente. Not the basilica itself, a chamber beneath it that most restorationists don't know exists. Father Giuliano met me at dawn on a Monday. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair, and the sort of measured speech that comes from years of choosing words carefully. We entered through a service door behind the apse, then descended stairs I would later realize don't appear on any architectural survey of the church. The stone was older than the 12th century structure above, possibly 4th century, from the original basilica, though Father Giuliano offered no history, and I knew better than to ask. The chamber itself was small, maybe 4 meters square, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling, entirely covered by a fresco of 6 seraphim. Each angel had 6 wings, as described in the book of Isaiah, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, 2 for flight. The style was Byzantine, formal and hieratic, rendered in the deep blues and gold leaf characteristic of that period. What made it unusual was the arrangement. The 6 seraphim formed a perfect circle, their wingtips almost touching, surrounding a central space that had been damaged at some point. The plaster there was missing, exposing bare stone. The commission requires complete documentation before any structural work begins, Father Giuliano explained. Photographs, condition reports, pigment analysis. Clean what you can, but documentation is the priority. He handed me 2 copper keys on a red cord. The outer door locks from the corridor. The inner door, he gestured to a second door I hadn't noticed, set into the eastern wall, remains locked at all times. Under no circumstances are you to open it. What's beyond it? A space we don't use anymore. His tone suggested the conversation was finished. I'll return each evening at 6 o'clock. You'll have complete privacy for your work. The chamber had no windows, no ventilation beyond a small grate near the floor. I set up my equipment by the light of LED panels, scaffolding, cameras, my cleaning solutions and soft brushes. The air smelled of stone and something else, something I couldn't quite identify, not decay, more like the scent of a room where something important once happened, where the walls themselves remember. I began with photographs, documenting every centimeter of the fresco from multiple angles. The seraphim were extraordinary, each face serene, but somehow alert, their dark eyes rendered with such precision that they appeared to have depth, real depth, as if the artist had somehow painted not just the surface of an eye, but the consciousness behind it. By mid-afternoon, I'd completed my initial assessment and begun testing cleaning methods on a small section of the uppermost angel's wing. The centuries of grime came away easily, revealing colors that seemed to glow even in artificial light. Lapis, lazuli blue, gold leaf that caught every photon, and beneath it all, such meticulous detail in each feather that I had to use magnification to appreciate the full craftsmanship. I worked until Father Giuliano returned at 6. He examined my progress with approval, then escorted me out through those unmapped corridors. I didn't ask why the chamber required such secrecy. In my profession, you learn that the church has reasons for everything, and most of those reasons are older than you can imagine. That night, reviewing my photographs at home, I noticed something odd. The uppermost seraph, the one I'd been cleaning, appeared to be looking downward in my morning shots. In the evening photographs, its gaze seemed angled slightly to the right, toward the damaged center of the fresco. I told myself it was a trick of the lighting. Fresco is painted on plaster. It doesn't move. On the second day, I arrived to find the chamber exactly as I'd left it. Or so I thought. At first, I took fresh photographs before beginning work, standard procedure for restoration projects. Then I climbed the scaffolding to continue cleaning the first angel's wings. That's when I realized its head position had changed. Not dramatically, perhaps 10 or 15 degrees, but enough that there was no mistaking it. The seraph was now looking directly at the center of the fresco, at that damaged space. I checked my morning photographs against yesterday's evening shots. The position was different, measurably, undeniably different. I spent an hour examining the plaster for any signs of structural movement, settling, moisture damage, anything that might cause the paint to shift. The substrate was solid, centuries, stable. There was no logical explanation, but I was a professional, and the commission had hired me to document, so I documented. I took measurements of every angel's position, head angle, wing placement, the distance between their wingtips. I used a laser level to establish reference points and recorded everything in my notebook with precise timestamps. Then I continued cleaning. By noon, I'd moved to the second seraph, the one to the left of the first. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of those dark eyes. All 6 angels, even the ones I hadn't yet cleaned, seemed to be watching me. Not with hostility, with expectation. As if they were waiting for me to notice something. I looked up often, studying the overall composition. The circle of seraphim. The damaged center. The negative space between their wings. Father Giuliano arrived at 6. I showed him my measurements, explained what I'd observed. He studied my documentation for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Continue your work tomorrow," he said finally, "but do not attempt to open the eastern door." I know, I'm simply reminding you. He paused at the threshold. "Some things require containment, Elena, not because they're evil, but because they're true in ways we're not prepared to understand." I barely slept that night. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke with absolute clarity, thinking about those measurements. About the geometry of the angels' positions. I got up and plotted everything on graph paper. The 6 seraphim formed a circle, their wingtips nearly touching. But when I calculated the angles between their current positions, they didn't sum to 360 degrees. They summed to 373.5. That's impossible in Euclidean geometry, in flat space. But what if the fresco wasn't depicting flat space? I measured the wingspans next, using the scale references from my photographs. Each angel's wings, when fully extended, should have been roughly equal in length. They weren't. The measurements described a curve, not around the circle, but inward, spiraling toward that damaged center. On the 3rd day, I entered the chamber and knew immediately that something had changed. All 6 seraphim had shifted. Their heads were now angled inward, focused completely on the center. And their wings, the geometry of their wings made my eyes hurt. The angles were wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. They bent in ways that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space, creating shapes that my brain couldn't quite process. When I photographed them and tried to measure the distances, my instruments gave readings that contradicted each other. A wingspan that measured 120 centimeters from one angle measured 98 from another without any change in position. I climbed to the top of the scaffolding, my hands shaking. I needed to examine that damaged center more closely. From up close, I could see that the plaster hadn't eroded naturally. It had been chiseled away, deliberately removed, but the destruction was recent. Perhaps only a few decades old, based on the tool marks, and beneath the damage, I could see what they'd been trying to hide. Text, not painted on the plaster, but written in the negative space between the converging wings. The precise geometry of the feather's edges formed letters, not in Latin or Greek, but in something older, something that hurt to look at directly. The words only became visible when the seraphim assumed certain positions, when their wings created the exact pattern of absence necessary to reveal what was written in the gaps. I was reaching for my camera when the outer door opened. Father Giuliano entered with 4 other men, not priests. They wore dark suits and moved with the efficiency of people who perform unpleasant tasks regularly. One of them began dismantling my scaffolding, while another removed the memory card from my camera. "Your contract is fulfilled," Father Giuliano said quietly. "The commission thanks you for your excellent work. Father, the fresco, the geometry will be documented by specialists with appropriate clearance." He handed me an envelope, full payment, plus a discretionary bonus, and a confidentiality agreement that I trust you'll sign without objection. One of the suited men placed a document on my work table, standard Vatican legal language, but with clauses I'd never seen before. Prohibitions against discussing not just the chamber's location, but its contents, the nature of the artwork, any measurements or observations. Violation would result in immediate legal action, and the phrasing was carefully vague. Appropriate spiritual consequences, I asked, in the negative space. Father Giuliano's expression was sad, a question that can only be answered once. The seraphim were painted to hide it. Elena, to make it visible only to those who understand what they're seeing, and only in the moment before understanding becomes knowledge. What does that mean? It means you saw words you cannot read, forming in spaces that shouldn't exist, and that's all you'll ever be able to say about them, because the moment you try to photograph them, measure them, translate them, the moment you try to make them permanent, they're not words anymore. They're just wings. He gestured to the eastern door. There are 17 chambers like this beneath the oldest churches in Rome. 17 frescoes, painted by artists whose names were erased from history. Each one contains something written in absence, in the mathematics of impossible things. The church doesn't destroy them, because destruction would be acknowledgement. We just seal them, let them shift and spiral inward toward whatever truth they're protecting or concealing. The suited men escorted me out through different corridors than I'd used before. Older passages, the walls marked with symbols I'd studied in seminary school, but never seen used practically. Protective sigils, perhaps, or warnings. I signed the agreement. Took my payment. Never spoke of it to anyone in the profession, but I kept my notebook with those measurements and calculations. And sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake up plotting those angles again, trying to understand what shape they were describing, what words they were forming. Last week, I received a package from the Vatican. No return address. Inside was a single photograph of the San Clemente chamber, taken from the doorway. The fresco is still there, but the seraphim have moved again. All 6 angels now face outward, their wings spread wide, their eyes looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "Don't look for the others." I haven't, but I know they're there, in 17 sealed chambers, containing 17 questions, painted in negative space. Questions that the Church decided long ago should never be answered, because the seraphim themselves, beings who stand in the presence of God, chose to hide them. And if beings that close to divinity thought something should remain concealed, perhaps the mathematics of their wings, the impossible geometry of their warning, is the only answer we were meant to have. Some books are catalogued, not by their contents, but by when they may be read. My name is Thea Sorensen, and I've served as a liturgical archivist in the Vatican secret archives for 7 years. I'm not clergy. The Church has allowed lay scholars in certain archival positions since the reforms of the 1970s, but my work requires the same reverence, the same discretion. I catalog prayer books, missals, breviaries, documents of worship spanning 2 millennia. Most are beautifully mundane, worn pages, faded ink, the accumulated prayers of countless faithful. The archives themselves occupy a labyrinth beneath the Vatican palaces, 53 miles of shelving in climate-controlled chambers. My section, liturgical texts and sacramental records, occupies the 3rd sublevel of the Borgia Tower extension. I work alone most days, which suits me. The silence feels appropriate here. almost liturgical in itself. In October of 2023, a collection arrived from a monastery in Umbria, 17 crates of materials dating from 1400 to 1600. The monastery had been decommissioned. Its brothers dispersed to other houses, and the local diocese wanted the historical documents preserved in the Vatican's care. Standard procedure. I'd processed dozens of similar acquisitions. The missal arrived in the 9th crate, wrapped in deteriorating linen. A small book, perhaps 20 centimeters tall, bound in dark leather that had gone nearly black with age. The cover bore no title, only a brass clasp shaped like a crescent moon. Inside the front cover, written in faded brown ink, Anno Domini, MCDL, XX, 1486. The pages were vellum, good quality, the kind made for important liturgical use, but they were blank. Every single page, front and back, empty, not damaged or faded. Simply never written upon. I recorded it in the catalog as an unused missal, likely prepared, but never inscribed. Such items exist, commissioned works that were abandoned, blank books kept for their fine materials. I placed it with similar liturgical curiosities and continued my work. 3 nights later, I worked late, finishing a condition report on a 16th century breviary. The archives permit, after hours, work with proper authorization, and I often stayed until 8 or 9 when deep in a project. That night, I worked until nearly 10. My desk faces a narrow window, more of a ventilation shaft, really, that opens to a light well between buildings. Moonlight occasionally reaches it during certain phases. That night, the moon was 3 days past full, and its light fell directly through the window onto my workspace. The missal sat on the corner of my desk, where I'd left it that afternoon. In the moonlight, the pages were no longer blank. Text had appeared, dense Latin script in dark red ink, filling the pages I'd examined just hours before, not faded or ghostly, but solid and clear, as though freshly written. The calligraphy was Gothic, typical of the late 15th century, executed with considerable skill. I should have reported it immediately, called the conservation department, documented the phenomenon, followed protocol. Instead, I pulled the book closer and began to read. It was a liturgy, a mass structure I recognized, the same format as the Roman Rite, with proper prayers and responses. But the words were wrong. Where the standard liturgy invoked Christ's sacrifice, this version spoke of older covenants, older hungers. The consecration prayers referenced flesh that lived before the breaking, blood that remembered its source. The Eucharistic prayer was longest, most detailed. It described a communion of 12 participants arranged in specific positions. The elements weren't bread and wine, but something the text called materia prima, first matter. The language grew more precise, almost procedural, describing temperatures and textures I didn't want to imagine. I read for perhaps 20 minutes before I noticed the moonlight had shifted. The beam no longer fell directly on the book. As I watched, the text began to fade, not gradually, but section by section, as though being erased by an invisible hand. Within seconds, the pages were blank again. I checked my phone, 10:43. I photographed the blank pages, then pulled the book fully into shadow. Still blank. I used my desk lamp, positioned it directly over the pages. Nothing. Only when I carried the missal to the window, letting moonlight fall across the open pages, did the text reappear. I photographed everything. 27 pages of liturgy, photographed in the narrow window while moonlight lasted. My hands shook. I told myself it was a chemical reaction, some ink that responded to specific wavelengths of light. Medieval scribes used clever techniques. There had to be an explanation, but I knew the archive's protocols. I'd signed the same agreements every specialist signs. Certain materials, when they exhibit anomalous properties, must be reported immediately, not documented privately, not photographed without authorization. I had already broken protocol, and I wanted to read the rest. The following night, I returned with my authorization card and the excuse of continuing the Umbrian acquisition. The moon was waning gibbous, rising later now. It wouldn't reach my window until nearly midnight. I worked on legitimate cataloging until 11, then waited. When the moonlight came, I had the missal ready. The text reappeared, and I continued reading where I'd left off. The ritual described careful preparation. The 12 participants each had specific roles: the celebrant, the witness, the keeper of names. 9 others called only the gathered. They met in darkness, in spaces below sacred ground, during hours when regular liturgies had ceased. What disturbed me most wasn't the ritual's obvious transgression of church teaching. It was how closely it paralleled legitimate liturgy. The same structure, the same reverent language, as though someone had taken the Mass itself and inverted it, made it point towards something older and hungrier than the God we were meant to serve. The final pages listed names and dates, 12 names per entry, organized in columns. The earliest dated to 1487, the year after the missal's creation. The most recent was 2022, last year, and 3 of those names I recognized. Cardinal Vieri, who oversaw the Archives Acquisition Committee. Monsignor Kress, head of the Apostolic Penitentiary, and Father Dominguez, the senior archivist, who'd assigned me this very collection. I photographed those pages 3 times, hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, at midnight. In the 3rd sub-level, where no one should be. I closed the missal and extinguished my desk lamp, pressing back into the shadows between shelving units. The footsteps were measured, unhurried. They stopped outside my door. A key turned in the lock. A key I hadn't heard from the inside, because I hadn't locked it. Father Dominguez entered, carrying a single candle. He was 68, Spanish, a Vatican archivist for 40 years. I'd always found him kind, grandfatherly. He'd mentored me when I first arrived. He looked directly at the shadows where I stood. "He said quietly. "I hoped you wouldn't find that one." I didn't move, didn't speak. "The moon reveals what daylight hides. You understand this now?" He set the candle on my desk, and in its light, I saw that his eyes were different, not changed physically, but aware in a way that made my stomach clench. "The liturgy you read is older than the Church's official rites. Much older. It was never abolished, because it was never truly separate, just set aside, preserved. The names are those who remember, who maintain the old covenants." He moved to the window, looked up at the moon. "Every institution has its roots. Thea, the Vaticans go very deep. Deeper than most can accept. This is heresy. Heresy assumes there's only one truth." He turned back to me, and his expression was almost sad. "You're Lutheran by birth." "Yes." "You came here for the scholarship, the history. You never took vows. This makes things simpler." I wanted to run. The door stood open behind him. but my legs wouldn't move. The book will be recatalogued, he continued, placed in a collection you don't have access to. Your photographs will be corrupted, a technical error very common with older phones, and you'll be reassigned. Milan, I think. They need liturgical expertise for the Ambrosiana Library. A promotion, really. And if I refuse, Father Dominguez picked up the missal, held it so moonlight fell across its pages. The text appeared again, dark red against vellum. He turned to the final page, to those 12 names. There are always exactly 12, he said. No more, no less, when one leaves. A space must be filled. He closed the book gently, the way one might close a prayer book after Mass. You'll receive your reassignment letter tomorrow. I suggest you accept it. He left, taking the missal and the candle. I stood in the darkness for a long time after, watching moonlight creep across the empty desk. I transferred to Milan 3 weeks later. The paperwork cited my expertise and the opportunity for advancement. Everyone congratulated me. My phone's photo gallery had indeed corrupted, a full data loss, unrecoverable. Sometimes I wake at 3:17 in the morning and wonder if they still meet, the 12, if they gather in chambers below the Vatican during dark hours, conducting liturgies that predate everything I thought was sacred, if the rituals in that missal still guide them, or if I'm being prepared. If reassignment was only the first step. Last month, I received a package from Rome, no return address. Inside was a small brass clasp shaped like a crescent moon, and a note in familiar handwriting. The Ambrosiana has its own traditions. You'll be contacted when the time comes. I keep the clasp in my desk drawer. Some nights, I take it out, feel its weight, wonder what door it will eventually open. The moon rises later now, waning toward darkness, and I've begun to dream in Latin. Old Latin, older than Church Latin, words that describe hungers the daylight church never acknowledged. There are 12 names on a list somewhere. 3 I knew. 9 I didn't. I'm beginning to think I know what the 12th space waits for. Some saints are not canonized but contained, and their chapels are not forgotten, but watched. My name is Father Ozan Demir, and I serve as a historical researcher for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. It's careful, quiet work, verifying miracle claims, examining medieval documents, tracing the lineage of veneration. Most of my days are spent in the Vatican's secret archives, now called the Apostolic Archives, though we all still use the old name, surrounded by centuries of carefully preserved testimony to holiness. In September of 2023, I was assigned to compile a comprehensive index of suppressed cults, those devotions the Church had formally condemned and forbidden. It was archival work, meant to create a digital database of historical prohibitions. Most cases were straightforward. Folk saints, whose veneration mixed too heavily with pre-Christian practices, or fraudulent miracle workers, exposed as charlatans. The Church has always been meticulous about distinguishing true sanctity from superstition, but San Lupo the Penitent was different. His name appeared in a 1612 decree from the Roman Inquisition, stamped in red wax with the seal of Pope Paul V. The document was brief, unusually so. It declared his cult suppressed, his chapel closed, his name stricken from all martyrologies and litanies. No explanation given, no list of heresies or false miracles, just erasure, swift and absolute. I found only 3 other references in the entire archive. A 1487 letter from a bishop in Umbria, requesting guidance about the wolf hermit, whose teachings trouble simple souls. A 1539 visitor's account describing a chapel where penitents pray through the night of the full moon, claiming to share in the saint's wilderness trial, and a 1611 memorandum, heavily redacted, that mentioned the Lupo matter and recommended permanent observation of the site rather than destruction, as the latter may prove counterproductive. The chapel, according to these fragments, stood in the Alban Hills, perhaps 40 kilometers from Rome. I could find no record of its destruction or conversion. It simply vanished from church documents after 1612, as if it had never existed. Professional curiosity compelled me to search further. I requested access to the Inquisition's classified archives, the sections still restricted even to researchers. It took 6 weeks to receive permission, and when I did, the approval came with a handwritten note from Cardinal Toretti, the prefect. Report any findings directly to this office before documentation. The Inquisition file on San Lupo was thin, just 4 pages, 3 of them entirely blacked out. The visible portion contained only fragments. Christ's 40 days provided template, for it assumes the nature of the beast as defense against, and veneration continues, despite prohibition, suggest. The final page listed an address in Genzano di Roma, a small town in the Alban Hills, and beneath it, in handwriting, I recognized as Cardinal Toretti's, fresh flowers observed March 22nd, 2023. Chapel remains active. Protocol Lupo maintained. Protocol Lupo. I'd never heard the term. I went to Cardinal Toretti's office the next morning. He was a careful man, precise in his theology and his speech. When I asked about the protocol, he was quiet for a long moment. It's a watching brief, he said finally. Certain sites require observation rather than intervention. The chapel is checked monthly. Has been since 1612. Someone still venerates him. Yes. Why not close the chapel? Consecrate it to an approved saint. Cardinal Toretti folded his hands. That was attempted twice. In 1614 and again in 1703, both times. He paused. Both times proved inadvisable. The current approach maintains stability. A seminarian drives out once monthly to document any activity. That's sufficient. May I see the observation logs? He studied me for a moment, then unlocked a drawer and removed a leather folder, unmarked. You may read them here. They do not leave this office. The logs went back decades. Neat, brief entries recording the date of each visit and any findings. Most were empty. No activity observed, but on every full moon, without exception, since the records began, fresh flowers present, white roses, 12 count, candles recently lit. I read backwards through years, then decades. 1897, 1842, 1768, always the same. 12 white roses. Fresh candles. No one ever seen, but evidence of recent presence. The oldest entry I found was dated March of 1613, less than a year after the suppression decree. Written in Latin, in a cramped, nervous hand, the chapel door was barred as ordered, but we found it open at moonrise. 12 roses on the altar, still wet with dew. We heard howling from the hills, though no wolves have been seen in these parts for 20 years. Brother Tommaso says we should burn the building, but Father Provincial insists we only watch. I do not sleep well on full moon nights. I'd like to visit the site, I said. Cardinal Toretti closed the folder. That's not necessary. The seminarian's reports are adequate. With respect to your eminence, I'm compiling a comprehensive index. I should examine the chapel directly. He was quiet again, his expression unreadable. Finally, you may go, but only during daylight hours, and you will report directly to me upon your return. I drove to Genzano di Roma on a Thursday in late October, 3 days before the full moon. The address led me up a narrow road into the hills, past vineyards and olive groves, until the pavement gave way to dirt. The chapel stood in a clearing surrounded by holm oaks, small and ancient, its stone walls weathered to gray. No sign marked it. No cross adorned its roof. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cool and still. The chapel was perhaps 5 meters long, with a simple stone altar and no pews. The walls were bare, except for a single fresco, faded but still visible. A man kneeling in prayer, his face gaunt with fasting, his hands clasped. Around him, painted in the shadows between trees, were the suggestions of wolves, just eyes and lean shapes, watching. On the altar, 12 white roses in a ceramic vase, their petals perfect and fresh. 3 candles, their wax still soft. I photographed everything, then examined the fresco more closely. The penitent's expression was strange, not peaceful, despite the prayer posture, but alert, watchful. His eyes were open and fixed on something beyond the frame of the painting. Behind the altar, I found a niche in the wall, covered by a loose stone. Inside, a leather-bound manuscript, its pages brittle with age. The text was in Latin, written in multiple hands, spanning centuries. It appeared to be a record kept by those who maintained the veneration, entries dated and signed, though I recognized none of the names. I photographed several pages, then read the most recent entry. It was dated 3 days ago, October 22nd, 2023. The night of the last full moon. In the wilderness, Christ learned what Rome could not teach, that grace requires the surrender of what we think ourselves to be, that to face the beast, we must know the beast within. San Lupo understood this. He fasted 40 days as Christ did, and in his hunger, he heard what the first hermits heard, the voice that calls from the edges of human form. We remember his teaching. We maintain his vigil. When the moon is full, we bring roses white as his hunger. We light candles for the transformation he endured. We pray as he prayed, not for deliverance from the wilderness, but for the strength to remain in it. I was reading the next entry, dated 17 years earlier, when I heard the sound, a howl, distant, echoing across the hills, then another, closer. It was 2 in the afternoon. Wolves don't howl in daylight. I stepped outside. The clearing was empty, the forest quiet, but I could feel a tension on me, the same sensation I'd felt once before years ago, when I'd been stalked by wild dogs in the Turkish countryside. The awareness of being tracked by something that calculates distances and angles. The howling came again, from multiple directions now, a pattern, almost, a call and response. I walked quickly back to my car. As I reached it, I saw something at the edge of the clearing, a figure standing among the trees, too far to see clearly, but the posture was wrong, hunched, arms too long, head at an angle that suggested either injury or something else entirely. It didn't move as I got in the car and started the engine. It simply watched until I drove away. That night, I woke at 3:17 in the morning with the absolute certainty that I was not alone. My apartment was dark and locked, but I could hear breathing, slow, measured, the rhythm of something waiting. I turned on every light and prayed the liturgy of the hours until dawn. I reported to Cardinal Toretti the next day. I showed him my photographs, described what I'd found, mentioned the howling. I didn't mention the figure in the trees or the breathing in my apartment. Some things sound mad when spoken aloud. He examined the photos of the manuscript for a long time. Then he took them from me, along with my written report, and locked them in his desk. The chapel remains under observation, he said. Your index will note San Lupo as suppressed in 1612, cult declared forbidden. No further details necessary. This matter requires no additional research. But Your Eminence, the veneration continues. Father Demir, his voice was gentle, but absolute. Some prohibitions are not enforced because they cannot be enforced. Some devotions exist outside the structures we've built. San Lupo taught that Christ's wilderness was not a trial to be survived, but a truth to be inhabited. That teaching cannot be permitted, but neither, it seems, can it be ended. So we watch, we document, and we do not participate. He stood, signaling our meeting was complete. At the door, he added, the seminary has reassigned the monthly observation to a different student. You will not be returning to that site. I haven't. But 3 days ago was the full moon of November, and at 3:17 in the morning, I woke to howling, distant but clear, carried on wind that shouldn't reach my window, 6 floors above the streets of Rome. I know what the logs will say. 12 white roses, fresh candles, no one observed. And I know that somewhere in the Alban Hills, in a chapel the church cannot close or control, people still gather to remember a saint who taught that holiness might require becoming something other than human. That Christ's 40 days taught a truth Rome could not accept. I don't research suppressed saints anymore. Cardinal Toretti transferred me to matrimonial tribunal work, reviewing annulment cases far from archives and forbidden histories. But sometimes, when the moon is full, I hear the howling, and I remember the figure at the edge of the clearing, watching with patience that felt ancient and knowing. And I wonder what San Lupo became in his wilderness, and whether his transformation ended when he died, or whether it continues still, carried on by those who bring roses and light candles and pray in ways the church declared forbidden 400 years ago. Some saints are venerated in cathedrals, others in clearings no map will show you, by people whose devotion requires no permission and fears no prohibition. The church watches and waits, and does not ask what answer the wolves are howling to each other across the dark hills outside Rome.